time. It's too much fun. You will.
Right, this is very good, man. I don't want any slack beginning for the day, right? Fire up. Take a deep breath.
No, that's right. You did your night the other night.
Remember, the world is watching you. I don't have to ask you if you can't watch your life.
Get in there. Let's go.
Honourable members, the Deputy Speaker.
Are there any constituency statements from honourable members? I call the member for Kingston Smith.
Thank you, Speaker. Prior to the 2019 New South Wales state election, the then Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, gave a firm commitment to our community that there would be no privatisation of bus services in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Gladys Berejiklian and indeed the new Premier, Dom Perrottet, misled our community because that is exactly what they have gone ahead and done in the wake of that election. They've let our community down and misled the people of the eastern suburbs because the New South Wales Liberal government has proceeded with the cutting of 24 local bus services and a large number of bus stops. And they're proceeding with the privatisation of the public bus service that is so beloved by many in our community and relied on by so many. It's a despicable act that will have a dramatic effect on the quality of life of so many in our community, in particular the elderly, people with a disability and children who rely on these bus services on a daily basis to go about their business. And over the last 6 months, I've been contacted by many constituents and locals who are dismayed at the decision made by the New South Wales government. And I want to provide a flavour of that response that I've had for the community for the House in this email that I received from Sandra of Botany, who writes, "Since school returned over 2 weeks ago, our kids haven't had a day that they could get home in under 2 hours. It's astonishing that it's taken them over 2 hours to travel 10 kilometres in a distance from Waverley to Botany. Our kids are usually exhausted and stressed by the time they get home, and this has consequently impacted on our whole family life." And this has occurred, Deputy Speaker, because the government cut the 400 bus service that this family relied on to get their kids to school on a daily basis. And they go on to say, when the state government decided to make changes to bus services, they've also decided to take away our suburbs' most vital bus service. And that is a reflection on what's going on with this government. Now, it's not just in Botany. From La Perouse all the way to Randwick, there's been cuts to services, and it's had a dramatic effect on people's quality of life. Speaker, the reason why we pay taxes is for governments to provide quality services, in particular quality healthcare, education and transport services. They're the vital services that people rely on a daily basis. And when you cut bus services like this, it has a dramatic effect on the people of our area. The Perrottet government should be ashamed of themselves for the disadvantage and the hurt that they've caused to so many, in particular pensioners and people with a disability.
Order, and I call the member for Moncrieff.
Well, Australia recognises our citizens for the hard work and contributions they make to develop and foster a prosperous, growing community for the betterment of all who call Australia home. Our honours and awards system recognises the merit of outstanding service and contributions of Australians. Recipients come from far and wide, right across our great nation, and from all walks of life, from different circumstances, to inspire and make positive change for future generations. While some are well known for their contributions, the majority are unsung heroes who make an impact in their own communities, unobserved by the public eye, but recognised by those who nominate them for their service and contribution to our great country. Typically, our country's heroes don't seek thanks or applause. They deserve both. The honours and awards system gives the nation a chance to celebrate and acknowledge those who work tirelessly to improve local communities and to make Australia a better place. I congratulate and pay homage to the citizens of Moncrieff who this year received such an honour. Chelsea Hodges, OAM, began swimming at 6 years old in Biloela in Queensland. Now a Gold Coaster, Olympic gold medalist and an inspiration to young women across the nation. Chelsea represented Australia for the first time at the FINA World Junior Championships in Indiana in 2017. And since then, her determination and dedication to sport has propelled her to the highest of all heights. Thank you, Chelsea, for your service to sport and representing Australia at the 2020 Tokyo Olympic Games and for bringing home more gold to the coast. Dr Stephen Godfrey OAM is President of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Ophthalmologists, a National RANZCO examiner and a visiting medical officer at Gold Coast University Hospital training and supervising registrars. Dr Godfrey is a general ophthalmologist treating all eye conditions. He is committed to the Outreach Eye Surgery Program in remote North Queensland, and Dr Godfrey operates at Pacific Private Hospital in Southport, John Flynn Hospital in Tugun and Gold Coast University Hospital. Thank you, Dr Godfrey, for your service to medicine as an ophthalmologist. Nick Marshall, OAM, is not only a recipient of one of Australia's highest honours, he is a recipient of the 2022 Australian of the Year. Local hero, he's my local hero actually, around the corner at Nobby Surf Club. Nick's contributed greatly through his dedication to surf lifesaving to ensure our beaches are safe for locals. Thank you, Nick, for your dedication. Captain Dennis McGuinness OAM for his significant contribution to meritorious service as a Regimental Sergeant Major and Manager of the Australian Army. And also, I would also like to congratulate Roger Emerson OAM for his dedication to the community.
Order. And I call the member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Some small businesses in the Blue Mountains and Hawkesbury describe the last 3 months as being as bad as November 2019. Now, that date is powerful in the minds of my constituents because it's when the smoke started from the Gospers Mountain fire and people literally stopped coming to the region for months. These are tourism and hospitality businesses that rely on a variety of things like international tourists, school excursions and seniors groups taking bus tours, and strong consumer confidence and confidence of locals to go out. If any one of those things is soft, then their viability is on the line. It's taking a toll on operators and their staff. You can hang on in business through a rough patch, but it's been more than 2 years of these conditions. Every time it feels like there's a hope of a good season, it's a fizzer or worse. Cafes battle not only with quiet weekdays, but with not enough staff or capacity to make the most of the sometimes busy tourist weekends. Travel agents are still doing it tough. Right now, they may be taking bookings, but it's often paid for by credits that travellers have from their cancelled COVID trips. So it still means very little or no income. One tells me the grants helped us up to this point, but where we go from here, I don't know, unless further grants are available. They're hoping the unused funds from the travel agents' support rounds are going to be made available to those who are still trading. The Federal Treasurer's declined to provide further support for small business, saying in a Sky interview I was watching a few weeks ago, with respect to New South Wales, I've had requests from other states and the answer's been consistent, which is we're bringing an end to that emergency economic support, we're moving to a more normalised setting. Now, that's not how it feels on the ground. The latest support from the New South Wales government continues to leave out the businesses it left out before, those who'd opened just before bushfires and COVID or were brave enough to do it during COVID, and those who had expanded so their turnover doesn't show a decline, even though it might be 2 shops running and double the operating expenses to achieve that. These businesses trusted what governments were telling them, especially about what to expect in the summer we're just ending. False hope from governments that things would return to some sort of normal. Many businesses have closed, sold, retired or given up, and others are just hanging on. Most businesses don't broadcast this. That's not what small business does, and I know. When business is tough, we put on a smile and we say, we're getting there, or it's just starting to pick up. Of course, it isn't all small businesses. Some are thriving, but those who aren't need support. One says to me about his business, if we can't hold on and we close now, in 6 months' time, governments will be providing incentives to someone else to get the same service up and running. Surely it makes more sense to extend the lifeline to those who really need it, who've hung on, rather than let them crash and burn.
The honourable member's time has expired, and I call the Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today I rise to highlight the outstanding work being done by one of Calaire's great service clubs, the newly named Lions Club of Mount Panorama. The club was formerly known as Bathurst Macquarie. It became part of Australia's largest service club organisation about 46 years ago. Since then, scores of outstanding members have volunteered their time and service to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to make the wider Bathurst community a better place for everyone lucky enough to call it home. The Lions' motto is "We serve." I know this because I too am a proud Lion, and I see what these wonderful men and women do for our communities and also our younger Leos. Members have and continue to be there in times of flood, drought and bushfire. Day in, day out, they quietly take on projects to improve the lives of area residents. Their work provides funds to buy vital equipment for those who need it most. A state-of-the-art wheelchair for young school students, hearing dogs, insurance to allow students to take part in riding for the disabled, toiletries and clothing for the city's homeless, a sewing machine, material and thread to allow disabled residents to learn to sew. All this valuable work is funded by money raised by the Lions. Their main income comes from the monthly Riverside markets, where members collect donations from visitors and fees from stall holders. Members also run a catering van to cook up a storm at fundraising barbecues. The food van and storage shed, Mr Deputy Speaker, is made possible thanks in part to Australian government funding. This month I was honoured to take part in celebrations to launch the club's new name, a name its members have chosen to take it into the next chapter. What better year to rename the club than the same year Lions Australia celebrates its 75th anniversary, and the same year Mount Panorama Lion Michael Ryan takes over as District Governor. I would like to acknowledge the selfless dedication of all of these wonderful Lions: President Sue Longmore, Secretary Judy Ryan, Treasurer Leslie Carter, incoming District Governor Michael Ryan, past District Governor Roger Thomas, Graham Carter, Ryan Cooney, Dennis and Sally Coops, Pat Duff, Alan and Kerry Harris, Jan and Roger Kendall, Terry Longmore, John McLean, Jennifer Murray, Glenn and Tracy Phillips, Michael Rindell, Alicia Thomas, Dean and Lorraine Ward, Kath Whitehead, Michael Whittaker, Margaret Ewell and Life member John Fish, who has been a Lion since 1968. These men and women exemplify the community spirit that makes Australia such a wonderful country. And on behalf of this Parliament, I formally recognise them and thank them for their dedication and service, and also recognise Lions right around Australia, wherever they may be, and thank them for all of their wonderful work. They are part of the fabric of our communities right around Australia, and we would certainly be lost without our Lions, and I know all members of this House join me in saluting our Lions and the wonderful work that they do.
And I call the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Parliament missed a valuable opportunity last week. We let slip the opportunity to protect all Australians from discrimination. Parliament failed to protect people of faith, all faiths, Christians, Hindus, Muslim women who are scared of having their hijab attacked for wearing a hijab, Sikh men worried about having their turbans ripped off in the street, Jewish people and so many more people of faith. On Prime Minister Morrison's watch, this Parliament missed the opportunity to protect people in the LGBTIQ community. Parliament missed the opportunity to protect children, all children, straight children, gay children, trans children, children, whoever they are. The Parliament failed. Instead, Prime Minister Morrison deliberately and cold-heartedly chose division and discrimination. He talked of unifying, but walked away when it mattered most. This sinister Prime Minister used trans children as a divisive tactic in a cold-hearted attempt to score political points. Just let that sink in. He used children in the hope of improving his electoral fortunes. The Parliament had a chance to extend protection from vilification for people of faith, particularly minority religions like my Muslim and Sikh communities, who've been telling me for years that they need this protection. Parliament could have stepped up last week. Instead, the Prime Minister stepped down. to the gutter. Labor moved an amendment to achieve protection, but the Morrison government made the decision to deny people of faith that protection. Last week, this parliament had a chance to extend discrimination protection to all children. The Morrison government made a decision to leave trans children open to discrimination. The damage of that shameful stance by the Morrison government, not all, has already been felt in the trans community. That low road should never have been a direction for this parliament. All children should be protected always. Sadly, the Greens political party were just as bad as the coalition last week. They abandoned people of faith in that important debate. In their desperations for relevance and to always attack Labor, the Greens failed to protect all Australians. They had the social media attack ads ready to narrowcast to certain groups who will help their electoral chances, who they think, when they should have actually been seeking to protect all Australians from discrimination. I want to make Labor's position crystal clear. We want to extend protection from discrimination to people of faith without removing existing protections from discrimination for other Australians. We want all children to be protected from discrimination, and this is achievable. It was achievable last week, but the Morrison government decided not to protect religious people from vilification and not to protect all children. The Morrison government opened their old and desperate playbook last week to divide the parliament and to divide Australians, pitting religious communities against LGBTIQ communities, pitting the rights of one group of children against the rights of another. It's a hard path to unite the country, and this government is not up to it.
Order. And I call the member for Dawson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and you'd be pleased to know, having a wisdom tooth pulled yesterday, that I'm going to be speaking a bit more slowly and a little less ferociously, but speaking nonetheless, because there were tens of thousands of people, perhaps even hundreds of thousands, not sure, that were vilified in this place and in the press recently, and those were the people who participated in the Convoy to Canberra rally that we saw over the last couple of weeks. The media and power elites have done their best to try and trivialise that protest, and they've focused on the very few, the very, very few in the crowd who probably didn't do the right thing, whereas the vast majority did. They trivialised the size of the crowd. I've got to tell you, having been there on both protest days, you're going to say if that was an NRL game, it would have been a packed house, and there would have been tickets that would have been sold out, and there would have been people wanting more tickets. It was the biggest rally at this place that I've seen in the 11 years that I've been here, and that was echoed by none other than Chris Ullman, who said it was the biggest rally that he had seen in Canberra in the past 3 decades. The media tried to claim at one hand that there was about 4,000 people at this protest. On the other, they were blaming them for overflowing the epic grounds where most of these protesters were camping. You can't have it both ways. Here in this place and in the media, the protesters were demonised and painted as fringe and violent, but the only violence that I saw was that committed actually against those protesters. Two instances of road rage, spurred on, I believe, by the biased reporting from the Canberra Times, which whipped up locals here against those people. Those people were far from fringe. There are people from all walks of life, from brickies to graziers, occupations all over the place, their tenure in those occupations written on their backs, doctors, nurses, teachers, fireys, ambos, who have lost their jobs due to no jab, no job mandates. Policemen that were even there. So these people deserve to be heard in this place and in state parliaments as well. What they are saying is a message that everyone should heed loud and clear. They want an end to these mandates, to the no jab, no job mandates, the no mask or the mask mandates, all the other restrictions, because the data is in and we find that it didn't work. Whether it was a vaccine mandate, they didn't work. Whether it was mask mandates, they didn't work. It all needs to come to a crashing halt.
Order. And I call the member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Over the past few weeks, as COVID subsides in my community, I've been honoured to start attending community events across the electorate of Werriwa. On the 3rd of February, I was pleased to be invited to join with the parish of St Luke's commencement ceremony for their new Reverend Timothy Booker. Reverend Booker has worked at St Luke's before with the outgoing Reverend Stuart Pearson. St Luke's is the oldest existing Anglican church in Australia, and services have been held on the site since the early 1800s. Reverend Booker is the 16th rector for the church, which demonstrates the commitment of the rectors previously to our community and their parishioners. Reverend Booker follows Reverend Stuart Pearson, who was this year named Liverpool Citizen of the Year for all the work he has done in our community over the past 20 years. Reverend Pearson has served our community, encouraging all at services, whatever their language or their ethnicity. The services are in many languages, and he also has been supporting volunteer groups. I wish Stuart and Julie all the best for a wonderful retirement. I know they'll still be very much part of our Liverpool community, and thank them for the support of our area over so many years. I attended this year's colourful Lunar New Year celebrations at the Minglang Buddhist Temple. The event is always beautiful, colourful, and this year's was no different. Welcoming in the Year of the Tiger, the weather was almost perfect, although the quick showers did make the fireworks very difficult to light, and I was privileged to be one of the people asked to do so. I'd like to recognise James Chang, Victor Kong, and all the work they and their volunteers do every day to support the large community who visits their temple. These leaders also do incredible work within our community and are often at the forefront of fundraising if required. They raised incredible amounts of money for those affected by the 2019 bushfires throughout New South Wales, as well as recent flood events and other natural disasters. Nothing is too much trouble for them to help with. I also attended the signing of the Australian Southeastern Asian Network Statement that was recognising the coming together of our Lao, Cambodian, Khmer Krom, Myanmar and Vietnamese communities. They are a large group of southwestern Sydney communities. This group intends to provide informal advocacy to engage with Australian governments, members of parliament and other institutions. There were special guests in the audience. I acknowledge the Venerable Abbots and all the other people, including Sawathi Ek OAM. As part of the initiative, there will be a youth group established, and I really do look forward to speaking with them about the issues that matter to them and their community and the wider Australian community. I really appreciate the hospitality shown at all these events, and thank you for the invitations.
Order, and I call the member for Cowper.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I recently had the privilege of being invited to meet with the elders and the community leaders at the Kinchela Boys' Home, a site that gave rise to significant generational trauma for the Aboriginal community in my hometown of Kempsey. The Minister for Indigenous Australians gave acknowledgement to Kinchela in his speech commemorating the national apology to the stolen generations, and he mentioned in that speech that the boys were only known by numbers, not by name. A testament to the dehumanising reality of Kinchela Boys' Home and the many other institutions like it around the country. Those boys were sent to Kinchela, were stripped not only of their names but also their identity and their connection to their culture. And while I listened to the elders speak of their personal experiences and the hopes and the plans that they had for the future, not just for the site, but more broadly for their community in Kempsey, I was particularly moved by their generosity in their collective desire to ensure, and I quote, that the pain stops with them. These proud Aboriginal men, these survivors of an institution that systematically stripped them of their culture and humanity, were focused not on what had been done, but what could be done for their children and grandchildren. There are currently plans in place to develop the site as one of a cultural commemoration where Australians of all background can come to acknowledge the past and to appreciate the significance of connection to culture and to community. And Joe Kelly, the project manager for the Kinchela Boys' Home, Aboriginal corporation and driving force of the Indigenous Youth Connecting to Culture, the IYCC, has also been leading the charge for a community action plan aimed at ensuring the voices of young Aboriginal people are heard. The plan has been devised after hundreds of hours of consultation with the community and will be used as a tool to increase cultural knowledge and understanding, as well as building pride, resilience and self-esteem. Deputy Speaker, I'm making this speech in this place today to ensure the Kinchela Boys Home Development Project and the work the IYCC team are recognised here, and I will ensure that I will assist in any way that I can in supporting their vision. The courage of these men is outstanding and they should be respected for the work that they've been doing. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Order. I thank the member for Cowper and I call the member for Bean.
Deputy Speaker, I rise today to speak about two extraordinary Canberrans. Sadly, we recently lost Professor Brendan Sargent to a terrible swimming accident on the coast. Brendan was the head of the highly acclaimed Security and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. He assumed this position after a long career in the Department of Defence, where he was a widely respected thought leader, rising to Associate Secretary and Acting Secretary. Before becoming the member for Bean, I represented engineers and scientists working in defence for over a decade. From that vantage point, I was able to witness the trials and tribulations of defence from up close. While I experienced many frustrations, my interactions with Brendan were always positive and professional. He had the hard-earned respect of the unions representing the defence workforce. He was intelligent and prepared to negotiate genuinely. He was always focused on Australia's engagement with the Indo-Pacific and the important defence elements of that engagement. Indeed, that focus predated the current climate, when regional engagement was not seen by some as a strong priority. In this, he was ahead of his time. Post-defence were both other halves of a friendship between our partners. We've lost a truly great servant of Australia. Vale Brendan, condolences to Vaidahi and family. Deputy Speaker, I also want to speak about a young constituent of mine who's facing a great battle. Jamie Larson wrote to me late last year to tell me about his story. Jamie, who is only 17, is suffering from Duchenne muscular dystrophy, a progressive muscular degenerative disease. At present, there is no cure. This insidious disease targets young men and boys, and Jamie was diagnosed when he was 3 years old. Jamie wrote to tell me that, thanks to medical breakthroughs, there are an increasing number of medicines nearing the end of their trials in the United States that look likely to receive FDA approval. But without a streamlined approval process from the TGA, it might be years until DMD sufferers in this country get access to the medicines. Last year, the Standing Committee on Health investigated this challenge. The member for Macarthur and yourself, Chair, both great advocates, have supported some changes in this space. And my friend, Dr. Freelander, said, we are at an inflection point in healthcare in Australia at the present time, because the rapidly increasing treatments becoming available for conditions previously considered untreatable. We need to do better for people like Jamie. We need the TGA to have a streamlined process for Australians to access new and life-saving medicines.
You almost get an extension for praising the Health Committee. I call the member for Ford.
Oh, thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise and speak about the great range of things that the Morrison government and coalition governments over the past few years have been delivering across the electorate of Ford, from health, hospitals, schools, childcare, local transport, infrastructure, sporting and community facilities, and finally environmental funding. They have all been part of our plan to deliver for the community of Ford. Since we came to government in 2013, we've increased funding to Queensland hospitals by over 102%, increasing from $2.7 billion to $5.4 billion of Commonwealth funding. The Commonwealth has subsidised over the past year some 2.3 million prescriptions through the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. Since October 2013, 2,847 new or amended items have been listed or will soon be listed on the PBS. This is the equivalent to 30 new or amended medicines a month, with an overall investment of some $14.3 billion. One of the important areas, Mr Deputy Speaker, sadly across my electorate, and I know many other electorates across Australia, is the issue of mental health funding. But I'm pleased to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have delivered on that in the electorate of Forde, through the support of the existing Meadowbrook headspace, but also the new headspace at Upper Coomera, both of which are doing an enormously important job for the youth in our community. And sadly, Mr Deputy Speaker, their services are now more greatly required than ever, and I know that they are busier than they ever have been. We've also seen tremendous investments in our schools, Mr Deputy Speaker, not just from recurring school funding, but also various grants to improve school facilities, like the Marsden State High School Oval upgrade, which now sees South Logan Magpies train out of there, and they'll play a number of games out of there this year. Norfolk Village State School and Eagleby State School have benefited from the health and wellbeing hubs, which, instead of parents having to travel to the Gold Coast or Brisbane for services for their children, those health services now have somewhere at the school where they can meet with the parents and the kids on the school ground, saving enormous amounts of time of parents travelling. And what we are finding is that parents are more readily able to and more willing to, importantly, meet with those services to see how their children can be helped at school. Whereas Kimberley Park State School in their Oval upgrades to provide disability access. All of these are examples of the Morrison government continuing to deliver for the electorate of Forde.
Order. In accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded. I call the clerk.
Government business. Order of the day number 1, Appropriation Bill number 3, 2021-2022, resumption of debate on the second reading.
Before the debate is resumed on the bill, I remind the Federation Chamber that it has been agreed that a general debate be allowed covering this bill and the Appropriation Bill number 4, 2021-22. And I call the question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Kingston.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, we are coming to the end of another term of this parliament. We may only have a few sitting days left to go, and it's time to give a report on this government, I think. And my electors and people in my electorate have been consistently telling me that this Morrison government deserves an F for failure. It is disappointing that this government, during this last term and indeed almost this decade long they've been in government, have failed to properly understand the needs of people in my community. When we look at this pandemic, right from the beginning, this Prime Minister said it wasn't his job to do so many things. He failed to order enough vaccines. He failed to roll out the vaccines properly. He failed to build fit-for-purpose national quarantine facilities to stop the virus entering the country. He failed to order enough rapid antigen tests, and he fails to ensure that there is a proper national plan. Now, he'll talk about a national plan, but the truth is that states and territories do not have confidence in this Prime Minister, that they've actually gone and done it themselves. And time again, when this Prime Minister and this government has been called out about some of these failures, what is the response we always get? Well, it's not my job. It's not my job. I'm not responsible for this. Where is the leadership in this? During this pandemic, Australians have been crying out for leadership. And what have we got? We've got a Prime Minister that has constantly picked fights, usually only with Labor premiers, but sometimes with his Liberal counterparts as well, pick fights and run commentary on their performance, but never himself has taken responsibility. Of course, it hasn't just been when it's come to the pandemic. It's whether it's the bushfire recovery, whether it's the robo-debt, whether it's the awful neglect that was already in aged care, whether it's the huge amounts of rorting schemes, sports rorts, or indeed car park rorts. It's just more and more excuses, more and more it's not my fault, and this passing the buck has just got to stop. Australians deserve better. Australians deserve a leader, a Prime Minister that will take responsibility and not just pass the buck, not just try and do a fancy announcement, but never actually deliver something properly to the community. Of course, I mentioned vaccines. The first, if we think about the vaccine rollout, Australia's vaccine rollout left us vulnerable. The lack of supply left us vulnerable as a country, and I heard countless reports from constituents in my electorate who desperately wanted a vaccine but just couldn't find one. I heard many reports from GPs who were confused about how to obtain the vaccine and the process of administration. And still, earlier this year, I still have parents contacting me worried about how to get a vaccine for their child. It was really, even as early as this, as late as this year, parents were scrambling for appointments, booking in at various places to try and get that. Of course, one local example is Lauren from Morphett Vale, who said she was very anxious and uncertain about going back to school. And this was compounded by the fact that her kids would not even get their first shot before heading back to school. She was unable to secure an appointment earlier. This just isn't good enough. We also have a booster rollout that is slow and was delayed by the original slow vaccine rollout. And so really, when the Prime Minister said it was not a race, I think it sent shivers down so many people's spines. It was a race, it still is a race, and we need this Prime Minister to stand up, this government to stand up. Of course, this is not the only example where the Prime Minister and this government has been slow to act. It's the same story again when it came to rapid antigen tests this summer. Rapid antigen tests have been used in the US and the UK, many other countries around the world, to get people back to work safely, to get kids back to school and start to return to normal life. Instead, in Australia, we had people at the most vulnerable stage of the pandemic, where we were seeing case numbers increase significantly here on our shores. We had many people lining up for PCR tests, couldn't get PCR tests, driving around and around. Then, belatedly, it was announced they could use rat tests, couldn't find any of them because the government hadn't actually planned for this. They hadn't prepared for this. And then had to be belatedly dragged, kicking and screaming, announcing their program for concession card holders, but leaving many vulnerable people being ripped off, many being undiagnosed, travelling around cities and suburbs and towns searching in vain for these tests. Of course, COVID has had a massive impact, and I think there are a lot of small businesses in my electorate that are feeling quite frustrated about some of the rhetoric of the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, talking about, really, if you read between the lines, saying that Australians have never been better off, and that is not the real lived experience of many small businesses in my electorate. Most recently, I met with Chris, who owns a cafe at Colonnade Shopping Centre. Chris purchased his cafe at Colonnades in January 2020. Not a great time. Since then, she and her team of 10 staff have been working hard to continue to service their customers. But trade is tough at the moment, with the increased density restrictions in South Australia and low foot traffic, because people are scared. People are scared. Even if they could go to the shops, they're worried and are not going. Chris shared that right now is the hardest it's been for her business through the whole pandemic. Yeah, that's right. Lockdowns were better for Chris than it is now. She told me she's just sold her house to keep her small business afloat. So for the Prime Minister to say that the economy's going great guns ignores the real lived experiences of so many small businesses in my electorate whose businesses may never be the same again. They may not make it through. And so we need to really understand that despite some of these headline economic figures, there are people that are really, really doing it tough and deserve our recognition and our support. Of course, in a pandemic, we have been left vulnerable as a result of a health system already under significant strain. When I look at my own state of South Australia, ramping in particular, which is, and for those that don't know, it's a term you don't need to explain in South Australia. That is where an ambulance goes out for an emergency, picks someone up and then sits in the driveway of the hospital because there just isn't the capacity in the hospital. Now, ramping in South Australia's hospitals were a problem before Omicron, but it is now a significant problem, and it's been compounded by this government as well as the South Australian government to properly prepare for the onslaught of Omicron. Last year, and just to give you some example, last year I was contacted by a family in Aberfoyle Park who were forced to call an ambulance when they were unable to see the local doctor. After calling 000 for an ambulance, the family were left waiting for over 2 hours to come to Aberfoyle Park. This family said it wasn't the first time they'd been left waiting for an ambulance in the last year. The mother said she had experienced a heart episode and after calling the ambulance was left ramped and waiting for treatment for 4 hours. So she had to wait for the ambulance and then was left for 4 hours. Of course, in addition to this, we have seen the issue around our hospitals compounded by this Morrison government's failure to properly address the primary healthcare system, particularly in terms of GP shortages. My local community in the southern suburbs are facing shortages of GPs that are preventing many residents from accessing basic healthcare they need. Those with regular GPs are waiting too long to get an appointment, and many doctors in the southern suburbs are stretched so thin they've been forced to close their books to new patients. Over 300 residents in my community have gathered together, signing a petition in just a few short weeks, calling on the federal government to address this GP shortage. Constance from Morphett Vale says, sometimes I've waited up to 3 weeks or more. I have heart failure, lung failure and kidney failure. I feel very afraid. I am unaware when I will need to access a doctor. Please help us in the south. Milton from Ranella East, I've waited up to 2 weeks. This is just not good enough. We should not have to wait 2 weeks to see a doctor. And Shirley shared her experience. I have to wait at least 3 weeks or 4 weeks for an appointment. I feel so sorry for our overworked doctors. Once again, this is a government that's failed to plan for our primary health system, and this is the consequences. And of course, as we've heard, it's throughout the media recently, our aged care system. Our aged care system, which we know was neglected by this almost decade-long old government, neglected, but of course the pandemic has opened our eyes to the existing problems that are there and has exacerbated them significantly. There have been over 600 deaths this year. There's 1,000 outbreaks right now in aged care. Tens of thousands of aged care residents have not got their booster shots. Over half the aged care workforce have not got their booster shots, and 12,000 residents and workers are infected as we speak. This is just not good enough. Where is the government? And I will not accept from this government, it's not my responsibility. So when it's come to the pandemic, this government has failed to plan, failed to act, loved the announcement, but has never been there to actually deliver. But the failures stem many, many years back then. I look at some of the issues that I've had to constantly fight on in my local community. whether that be the NBN, which still, after this government came to office in 2013, ripped up a plan that was starting to deliver proper long-term results for communities, building the infrastructure right first time. But of course, no. Tony Abbott, the then Prime Minister, thought that this was just about watching Netflix, failed to understand the absolute critical need that small businesses needed, the at-home internet. Of course, this has been exacerbated by the pandemic, where many people have told they have no other option but to work from home. And I've heard countless frustrations of those in my community that have had to rely on this government's infamous copper to the node. Copper to the node where new copper was laid where the old copper was, is failing to deliver the results that so many residents need. Of course, the government has sheepishly, put out that, they realise it's been a bit wrong, and they're going to go back and pull up the copper that they just laid and replace it with fibre. But only 10% of households that are relying on this copper and the failed HFC network are actually going to benefit from this. That leaves suburbs like Aberfoyle Park, Flagstaff Hill and many others having been laid new copper. Every time there's rainfall, they lose their internet. They get promised speeds by internet companies of up to 100 megabits, but can't get past 10 or 20 megabits. I mean, this is a failure of a grand scheme and the lack of vision that this government has had. Of course, on some more local issues, we've had a failure in many grants programs, and I think very much of the South Adelaide Football Club. Great football club, wants women's change rooms, dutifully applied for women's change room funding from the federal government, and of course, I'm sure were rated very highly by Sports Australia, but were dudded during the Sports Rorts fiasco. Dudded, did not get the money they deserved for women's change rooms. Instead, in South Australia, it went to a rugby club without women's sport, and that was a women's changing room facility. This government has rightly been given by my community a big F, an F for failure on the report card of this term. And I will be working hard as we approach this next election to make sure the positive alternative is put out there, and we will let the Australian people decide.
Order. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Blair.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, on this side of the chamber, we always support appropriations bills. It goes back to our long legacy of the dark days when a Labor government was held over to parliamentary ransom by a coalition that wouldn't respect the House of Representatives, and we have a strong position, principally, to support appropriations bills, even if we don't agree with every single thing that's in that particular bill. But this is an appropriation of about nearly $16 billion, and it covers a whole range of portfolios from agriculture to defence to the digital economy and a whole range of areas. In relation to this particular appropriations bill, I want to take the opportunity to speak generally about where the economy stands and where this government has, in my view, failed dismally. Before they came to power nearly a decade ago, they promised there'd be surpluses in every budget year, and certainly in the first year and every year thereafter. That's what the then member for North Sydney, Joe Hockey, said, the shadow Treasurer. They haven't delivered one. The longest period of time in terms of consecutive deficits that this country has seen for about 40 years or more. And on this side of the chamber, when we have constantly been criticised on debt and deficit, we won't take lectures from a government that's racked up $1 trillion in debt, delivered deficit after deficit after deficit, can waste $20 billion on JobKeeper for businesses that didn't deserve it, didn't need it and made profits, when they wouldn't support people who were in a situation where they were casual workers or people on visas in this country who had to rely on the generosity of the Australian community to maintain them.
This is a government that prides themselves on being allegedly a low-taxing government, the second highest taxing government in the history of the Commonwealth of Australia, who had multiple failures. And my community has seen it writ large, whether it's in the digital economy, as the member for Kingston talked about, where you've got whole suburbs and regional areas where they're going to have to rip up what they've done and eventually bring in fibre to the premises. One of the terrible legacies of the former Prime Minister, the member for Warringah, Mr Tony Abbott, and of course a subsequent Prime Minister in Malcolm Turnbull, was the failure on the NBN, which has disadvantaged regional and rural communities massively. It's a point of equity and equality in this country that we need to have a digital economy that will help farmers and students and people living in regional and rural communities in circumstances where they can have the same equality of opportunity as people living in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. But that's not happened. That's not happened. And a government that could spend over $50 billion when they promised it would cost $29 billion and promised they would have it all done years and years ago is going to have to rip it all up again, in large part on the HFC connections, and do it all over again. They should never have done it. There's a policy decision that they undertook years ago. They should have done it once, done it right, and do it with fibre, as Tony Windsor once said. So we need investment in roads and rail and digital infrastructure to improve the economy. But this government has failed on so many levels in terms of the economy. One of the things I want to talk about is their failure to accurately support wage claims and improvement of wages and conditions for workers. You know, 52 of the 55 forecasts when it came to wage increases, they have failed. They have constantly failed, and even now can't bring themselves to support wage increases in the aged care sector. So they'll dole out, election sweeteners that come in right up until the day of the election in May, which will only benefit 6% because the overwhelming majority of people who work in the aged care sector who will get the benefit of this funding, this little almost wage tokenism, are indeed full-time workers, only 6%. So many people will not benefit in any way whatsoever because they're casual workers and because they have been disadvantaged by a system that has been let down by the coalition. Whether it was MyEFO 2015-16 or the budget 2016-17, which indicates nearly $1.7 billion in cuts to the aged care sector, a sector which has been under tremendous strain by this government, its failures in terms of quarantine, vaccination, the booster program, PPE and rapid antigen tests. I have been to aged care facilities in my electorate that are at straining, people losing jobs, shifts not being filled, people not getting the kind of support and care they need, people struggling with COVID. And the government has monumentally failed across this space, with a minister who thinks that the aged care sector is doing exceptionally well. Well, over 700 people have died since January, and the minister thinks the sector is doing exceptionally well. Well, come and visit the aged care facilities, and I was at one last Friday, Cabanda in Rosewood, in a rural town in my home city of Ipswich. And Cabanda is struggling. Cabanda struggled with PPE and RATs, increased costs because of COVID, and a classification that's wrong. And I've raised that issue on a number of occasions in this chamber. But when it comes to this, the government wants to take credit for everything and responsibility for nothing. For nothing. They constantly talk up their achievements but fail to deliver. And I want to give just a couple of examples of that when it comes to the areas that I deal with as Shadow Minister for Defence Personnel and Veterans Affairs. I want to pay tribute to people like Glenn Kolomitz and others, a lawyer who's been helping Afghan veterans, veterans in this space, and so many other people who've been supporting them in this area. They feel let down by a government that talked about their achievements in Afghanistan and the evacuation. We're thankful for everyone who's been evacuated, for our ADF personnel who did it. But we have a moral obligation. And this government didn't evacuate people quickly enough, didn't take up the offer from the Americans to evacuate people. And we're letting them down. There are still people over there, security guards, Afghan interpreters, people who worked with our embassy, people who worked with our people over there, who are still languishing under the Taliban and the despotic rule of the Taliban. And what are we doing to get them out? Very little. It's not only a national security responsibility for this country to not let down those we've supported in war and peacekeeping operations, but it's also a moral obligation and an ethical obligation. And the impact on those veterans in the ADF now is writ large for all to see, because we have a Royal Commission that has been established with the work and the advocacy of people like Nikki Jamieson, Karen Bird, Julianne Finney and so many other people who pushed hard for a Royal Commission. It's sitting now in Sydney right now. It was in Brisbane last year. And what have we heard during that time? We have heard about mental health issues, suicidal ideation. We've heard about bullying, bastardisation. We've heard about harassment, sexual assault. We've seen people who have committed suicide and the impact on their families. This has been going on for quite some time. This is confronting issues that will confront not just the ADF, but governments in the future. But this government has let us down and let the ADF down and the veterans community down. Waiting times in terms of processing claims are blowing out. The 100-day rule is just a nonsense. 28% of the people in terms of their applications for compensation and for claims are being dealt with in the 100 days. We have the Senate Finance and Public Administration Committee giving evidence last year, and the evidence was overwhelming, that under the Merkel legislation, the Durka legislation, the VEA legislation, claims are blowing out. Claims of 50,000 claims are currently waiting to be processed, and that's the evidence that came out in Senate estimates last night. This is having an impact on mental health and our veterans and their families. But one of the things I want to finish on is a bit of evidence that came out last night. Now, we've got to go back to October last year, where the minister announced a McKinsey review. The government loves privatising, labour hiring and outsourcing, and one of their favourite organisations is McKinsey. So they spent $1.3 million on this external review that was, the minister said, his action plan that was going to be delivered by end of last year. An action plan that was going to reform the Department of Veterans Affairs, where 34% still of the people who work there are labour hire, working for one of 46 companies that the current government engages to deliver services. Why they don't lift the ideological cap and employ public servants who are experienced to process and fill up the public service in the Department of Veterans Affairs to complete the process in time, I'll never know. But they spent $1.3 million on this McKinsey action plan. They've never released it. I've called for it multiple times. They've never released it. I sat opposite in the chamber in the House of Representatives. Minister sat opposite me and I called on him to release it. They still haven't released it. They still haven't done that. And so the process times keep blowing out. Now, we heard in Senate estimates last night that this review is a dud, a complete dud. Having interviewed a total of two families, they received only 3 formal submissions and 33 emails from the public. They spent $1.3 million of taxpayers' funds on this report to overhaul DVA claims in that period of time. 3 months after it's been completed, we're told, its findings and its recommendations remain secret. That's one example. I could give so many, says it all. With backlogs of claims getting worse in the Department of Veterans Affairs and the evidence showing the outstanding amount growing, as I said, to 50,000 claims, a Royal Commission which has found and heard evidence about veteran suicide being linked to the backlog of claims, and the Royal Commission said the backlog of claims is, I quote, unacceptably high. We've got a review that cost the taxpayers money $1.3 million, not released, recommendation secret. They met with, as I say, 3 formal submissions, 33 emails, 2 families. What did they do for $1.3 million? 2 families. I say to the Minister, release the report and the recommendations. This is the action plan. It reminds me of their mental health strategy and the strategy they were going to do that followed the Productivity Commission report that came out on the 2nd of July 2019. Well, the sort of report they were going to do, the response, had more blank pages and pictures and was a recitation, a litany of the government programs with almost no recommendations, no action to be undertaken. So that's the legacy of this government with respect to the Department of Veterans Affairs and the hundreds and thousands of people that they interact with every day. $11.7 billion is spent every year on this department. Hundreds of thousands of people. There are 60,000 people approximately in our ADF, including reservists. And this government has let them down. They can't deliver submarines. They can't deliver defence platforms. They cancel at huge, programs at huge costs. When dealing with our trusted allies and friends like the French, they don't do the thing in many respects in the way they deal with them. They let their contractors down. But look, I say to the Minister, when it comes to the Department of Veterans Affairs, you're not achieving your defence personnel requirements and not 1 year since 2016 in terms of reviews that have happened since then, have you fulfilled the number of people who are actually entering the ADF. And why? Because the government can't deal with them when they exit and transition in terms of housing and homelessness, in terms of employment and the opportunities, in terms of support for rehabilitation and compensation, in terms of claims. The Department of Veterans Affairs at the moment is outsourced and privatised and labour-hired more than any other Commonwealth department. I say to the Minister, lift the ideological cap, improve and reduce the backlog, release the McKinsey review and engage with the Labor opposition, and let's work with the recommendations of the Royal Commission and veterans communities around the country to improve the situation. Minister, do your job.
Order. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Greenway.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I seek leave to continue my remarks from last night, please.
Is leave granted? The member may continue.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. To wrap up, I have been talking about a very special constituent of mine, Mr Damien McRae and his son Aidan. And in 2017, I brought some private members' business to this chamber, highlighting that Damien, who unfortunately had been diagnosed with melanoma, was seeking to pursue some sort of initiative with his son to raise awareness of melanoma in a uniquely Australian way. And what they did, they developed a SunSmart beach-themed Lego project called Lego Surf Rescue. They managed to get the 10,000 supporters required for Lego to consider this as something that they would mass produce. Unfortunately, Lego turned that down. There was bipartisan support in this place for that to be acceded to. But this made the news recently when it's been revealed, and I quote the headline from the Sydney Morning Herald from February the 11th, Lego accused of stealing beach set design from cancer patient and son. And just quoting from that, Mr McRae was astonished to learn last week that Lego had released onto the market its own beach lifeguard station, but unlike his design, nobody was wearing a hat or sunscreen. And probably unbeknownst to Lego, Damien McRae happens to be an intellectual property lawyer, so he's well aware that what could be minor changes in design would avoid breaches of copyright. So what I would like to do in the remaining time, Mr Deputy Speaker, is to implore LEGO to do the right thing and be good ethical citizens. I suspect they have done very well, as some organisations have done out of the pandemic, being a time when globally LEGO, of course, a very popular brand, but people being in various stages of lockdown have turned to LEGO, not only for play but for mental health in many cases, and good luck to them. But that's all the more reason why they should be good ethical citizens in this instance. As was true, unfortunately, when I made those remarks a number of years ago in this place, Australia still has one of the highest rates of melanoma in the world, and melanoma is often referred to as Australia's national cancer. And I want to acknowledge also the member for Blaxland, who since that time has himself become a melanoma sufferer and, of course, is recovering, but has become a great advocate for melanoma prevention and awareness as well. Melanoma is the deadliest form of skin cancer, and it's estimated that 1,300 people will die from melanoma in Australia this year. Early education designed to inform children in particular in a fun and innovative way, like using LEGO, could change these statistics for the better. So on behalf of the people of Greenway, I implore LEGO to do better, and we recognise Damien and Aidan for their ongoing dedication to making the world a safer, more sun-safe, sun-smart place to live. And I want to end on a few words that Damien provided to me. I am angry and disappointed in LEGO now. When I told Aidan, who is 12 now, what had happened, he simply rolled his eyes. He doesn't want anything to do with LEGO now after this experience. I fear that the lesson I've taught my son is not to follow on through with your ideas, but don't bother following your ideas because some bigger fish will steal them from you for themselves. The only other thing I'd say is that if LEGO had any decency, they should also give some credit to my then 5-year-old son, whose idea this project was. I still love LEGO bricks, and I think there is still a place where we can have a win-win here. We don't want any money, we just want LEGO to add sun safety features in their beach sets, such as faces with sunscreen and sunscreen bottles. This would help educate kids and parents around the world, including Denmark, which has the 4th highest rates of skin cancer in the world after Australia, New Zealand and Norway. If Crown Princess Mary is Denmark's biggest supporter of teaching Danes about skin cancer and sun safety, surely Denmark's largest company can get behind this same message. And I certainly echo that, Mr Deputy Speaker. I thank Damien, but also Aidan and his family for their incredible resilience. Damien, of course, has survived to this point. I hope he continues to have a long and fulfilling life, and Aidan continues to have such a fantastic father. But in the meantime, LEGO, do the right thing. Even if it is not recognising in a monetary sense and also in an intellectual property sense who actually had some contribution towards this. Exactly as Damien says, put sun-smart features on those creatures. Put a sunscreen bottle there, because if nothing else, if it prevents even one family from losing someone they love, then that would have been time and effort well spent.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. The member for Macon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill is about appropriation, and appropriation, as we all know, is about funding. Excuse me. Funding defines a government's priorities, its ideologies and its competency. And that's what I will focus much of my remarks on today. On Wednesday, in my 3-minute statement, I summarised some of the defining features that best characterise the past 9 years of coalition governments. The list of matters I referred to was not comprehensive, so today I will restate those matters and provide some additional observations about our nation today. We have a government that is beset by disgraced ministers who have presided over the continuous mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic, failed to secure adequate vaccine supplies, failed to secure personal protection equipment, and then failed to not only provide the latest rapid antigen test kits, but did nothing about quarantine facilities. Then they paid billions of dollars in JobKeeper payments to very profitable companies that didn't need the money and whose profits soared, while many deserving workers got absolutely nothing. It is estimated that the amount of money paid to profitable companies is somewhere around $20 billion, perhaps the biggest waste of public money that I have ever heard of. Mr Deputy Speaker, let me go to some of the other matters. We then have the $1 billion robo-debt debacle, which not only cost the $1 billion, but I understand also cost real lives of people. The ongoing crisis in aged care. And when you have to bring in the army to assist with the aged care sector, that tells you that it is more than a crisis. I've never known of anything like that ever having to be done in the past. And yet we have a government that seems to want to just brush it to one side. Across the country, we have a deterioration in our national health services. We have worsening inequality, with the highest 10% of households by wealth now owning almost half of all wealth, and the lowest 60% owning just 16%. Australian education outcomes have markedly fallen when compared with other countries. On climate change, Australia now ranks near the bottom of 61 comparable countries on a global performance index. Australia now has the second highest level of biodiversity deterioration in the world. And then there is the Morrison government's total mismanagement of the NBN rollout, which not only nearly doubled the cost from around $29 billion to well over $50 billion, but NBN speeds in Australia are among the slowest in the developed world. The Great Barrier Reef is at serious risk, and we saw some acknowledgement of that a couple of weeks ago when the government finally acknowledged that it needs to spend some money. Too little, too late. Australian foreign aid contributions are at an all-time low. And after 9 years in office, and now into its third proposal, the first nuclear submarine is not likely to be in service for another 2 decades, again leaving Australia vulnerable. And whilst Australians call for more honesty in government, the Morrison government refuses to have a National Integrity Commission. But it has stacked the courts and the administrative appeals tribunals with its mates, many of whom are underqualified for the job. In other attempts to avoid scrutiny, the Morrison government has cut $783 million from the ABC and $14 million from the Audit Office. The coalition killed off Australian car making, but now pretentiously talks about backing Australian manufacturing. And at a time that it talks up national security, it has presided over the 99-year lease of the Port of Darwin. Can I go to some of the rorting? And again, this is not a comprehensive list, but perhaps some of the more publicly talked about issues. There was a $660 million car park fund primarily used to fund questionable car parks in coalition-held marginal seats. Then we had the $100 million sports rorts used to fund projects again in coalition seats. Millions of dollars in water buybacks, sometimes paid out at rates well above market rate and, not surprisingly, to people either connected to or friends of this current government. And we had the $220 million regional rorts program, the $3 billion road rorts program where some 83% of the funding went to coalition-held seats, the $150 million pool rorts fund, again where just about all of the money went to coalition seats, the $444 million Great Barrier Reef Foundation allocation, criticised by the Auditor-General and without any justification whatsoever. The $30 million paid for the Leppington Triangle Airport land, again purchased at an estimated 10 times the market value, and even more concerning is that the land was then leased back to the buyers at a value of less than $1 million. The $39 million allegedly improperly paid to an Australian shipbuilder, and the $1 million wasted on Clive Palmer's High Court challenge to the Western Australian border closures. Mr Deputy Speaker, in the course of this debate, I've heard coalition speakers come into this chamber and boast about the number of projects they've been able to secure funding for in their electorate. What they were really doing was acknowledging the rorts of this government and how it channelled all of those funds into coalition-held seats. The question today is whether Australia is in fact a better place after 9 years of coalition governments, and could we have done better over that time? More importantly, people are now asking what are the emerging difficulties into the future, and who is best able to lead us through those difficulties. It is navigating difficulties that takes good leadership, something that is sadly lacking in this government. And I'll begin by talking about the economy, and government claims that they are better economic managers. The claim is simply untrue, as many speakers from this side of the House have pointed out in their contribution to this debate. And after we have seen this government in office for 9 years, as has been pointed out by other speakers, national debt has not only doubled before COVID, but today is getting close to $1 trillion. This is a government that has had 9 years to get its house in order, to get its economy in order, and to get its budget in order. 9 years. The excuse that we had to correct the mistakes of the previous governments and that ran out years ago. But after 9 years, if they can't do it, when will they be able to do it? The reality is that they can't, because they do not have the competency. We then go to housing ownership, and that's one of the most critical issues in most people's lives. It's probably the biggest investment they will make. Ownership rates in Australia are falling. House prices are now skyrocketing. And for most first home owners who want to get into the housing market, it's likely that they will never be able to do so unless they have very rich parents or are on very high incomes. For those who can get a loan, future interest rate rises are likely to cripple them. And at the same time, public housing numbers across Australia are falling. In my own state of South Australia, 3 decades ago, there was over 60,000 public houses available in the state. Today, the number is just over 30,000. Even if you add to that the community houses that are available, the figure for social housing is well below what it was 3 decades ago. No wonder we have people that are homeless, and no wonder people are struggling to get a roof over their head. Housing security matters. Housing security, whether it's public housing, private rental or personal ownership, creates stability and certainty in life. And that's why Labor's $10 billion commitment to social and affordable housing, where 30,000 houses will be built, is so important. The Morrison government also talks about building up the economy through immigration and the like. And can I say, again, I see a government that constantly relies on population growth to grow the economy. And if you look at the forward estimates where they project economic growth, it's all based on population growth. Economic growth should not be dependent on population growth. The 10 most livable countries in the world all have relatively stable populations, and most of them have a population of less than 10 million people. We should have a strong and growing economy, and population growth should not be used to prop up the economy, but to allow further expansion of economic opportunities where workforce shortages are a constraint. We then look at unemployment. The statistics on unemployment don't reveal the real situation. As is said time and time again, an hour of work a week is not employment. Today we have people that are working multiple jobs to make ends meet. And even worse than that, those multiple jobs, or even if people have full-time jobs, have never been more insecure. Wages are stagnant, and my concern is that whilst we talk about and we see that the unemployment rates appear to be falling, once the borders are fully open and overseas temporary visa holders and backpackers and students come back into the country, they will absorb many of the jobs that are currently available. And so unless we do something about securing jobs for the people today, the situation will change again in the future, as it has been for the last decade, where unemployment rates were much higher and underemployment rates were even worse. Job security is critical for people's future. It is the one thing that people care about more than anything else, because without job security, they see no future. And yet again, I see a government that is prepared to allow people to come in, and rightly so in many cases, but to come in without ensuring that the jobs that are in this country are secure, not only for them, because many of them are exploited when they come in and get work, and we've had plenty of evidence of that, but without ensuring that the people within Australia have the secure jobs that they are looking for. The situation is deteriorating. Most Australians do not have secure work. Even those people who have full-time work, because of the changing nature of the economy, there is less security in any job today than ever before. We have a government now that is clearly in its dying days. It has reached, as I said in my 3-minute statement, its use-by date. It has become an incompetent rabble where even its own members are turning on each other and turning on their Prime Minister. And its rorts over the last 9 years have become a lead weight around this government's neck. And that is why they don't want an anti-corruption commission. They have fought tooth and nail to stop that happening. They talk about it, as we all know, but they really don't want it. And they don't want it because they don't want it to expose and inquire into their very own rorts. But that will change if we get a change of government. And I have no doubt that this coalition government of today will try to buy its way back into government when it hands down its budget next month. And it will run a smear campaign against the Labor leader Anthony Albanese, as it's been trying to do over the last few weeks and every day in question time in this chamber. And it will run a fear campaign against Labor on national security, international security and taxation. And again, we have seen that day in and day out. It is all they have left to campaign on. But it will take a lot more than that to save the Morrison government. And it's time for an Albanese-led Labor government to take office in this country.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. The member for Jagajaga.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, I rise today to highlight some of the many areas where people in my community are being failed, let down by this Morrison government, and the very real impact that that is having on their lives. Deputy Speaker, I am sure that I am not the only one in this place whose office is currently inundated with NDIS participants and their families who are desperate for help. It is an absolute indictment on this government and the way they run the NDIS that I currently essentially employ a staff member full-time whose entire role is taken up with helping participants and families navigate the NDIS system. This system is just not working as it should. And in fact, at the moment, the stories I'm hearing, the experiences that people are relaying to me, is one of parents lying awake at night with anxiety about what's going to happen when their child's plan comes up for a review. It's actually of families breaking down because of the level of stress and anxiety they are carrying. And these are stories in one electorate alone. Imagine what is happening across our country because of this Morrison's government's failures to take the NDIS seriously, to resource the scheme as they should, and to respect people with disability, their families and their carers. Deputy Speaker, some of the themes of what I'm hearing from NDIS participants and their families are of parents overwhelmed and in some cases emotionally beaten by the administrative barriers that are there to getting support for their children. I'm hearing about long delays in decision-making which sometimes, but not always, can be overcome when my office intervenes and makes a representation. But it shouldn't take that. It shouldn't take people needing to go to their local federal MP to be able to navigate a government system and get the support they need for a child with disability or for an adult with disability, for people in our community. I'm hearing from parents who are at a point where they have actually just decided to disengage, that the emotional trauma, the efforts they are going to is not worth it. And so they are actually giving up on the system. What an indictment. And of course, like so many around this country, I am hearing of packages that are being slashed by tens of thousands of dollars after a review, and the very real consequences that is having, particularly on children. I do want to go into some of the specifics of what families are raising with me, because I think it's important that they are aired in this place, but I'm not going to use names or any identifying factors because those families have rightly asked me to respect their privacy. So I can tell this place about a boy under 10 with autism spectrum disorder. He's had a reduction of tens of thousands of dollars on a previous plan. His mother said that when she was needing to interact with an NDIS planner, those interactions came at times when she was caught unprepared and she felt off guard, and that had a negative impact on the outcome of her plan review. Since the plan has been slashed by tens of thousands of dollars, the boy's therapists and the boy's school have observed an escalation of concerning behaviours and a regress in his general coping. His mother says, "The lack of empathy and person-centred approach exhibited by the NDIA towards my son and I have been cruel and dehumanising. This decision keeps him, disregards his needs, shuts him down and keeps him separate from society. The lack of funding and formal support has left me having to decide which of my children's needs are more important. Without these supports, I must make heartbreaking decisions as a mother that could drastically change the future of my children." She says, "We are on the brink of a monumental breakdown as a family unit due to the sudden and extreme reduction in funding, without explanation from the NDIA, despite us repeatedly asking them for a reason behind the decision. My family and I are literally drowning, emotionally, physically and financially, as a direct result of the sheer disregard and lack of support we've received from the NDIA." That should not be the case. This is not what the NDIS was set up to do. It was set up to give children with disability, to give adults with disability, to give their families the opportunity for these people to live the best lives possible. Instead, it is causing families to break down, and that is on this Morrison government. A participant whose wife contacted my office in December last year because, despite submitting plans and an application for a bathroom modification in March last year, they'd heard nothing from the NDIS. So they submitted the plans in March. By December, they still had heard nothing back from the NDIS, and all the while her husband's mobility was declining. In her email to my office, she said, "We don't usually send complaints, but this time I felt I needed to." Well, absolutely fair enough. How is that reasonable that she was waiting from March to December for a decision from the NDIS on this bathroom modification, which had serious consequences for her husband's mobility? A mother told my office that, a mother was told by the NDIA that there were no funds left in the plan of her son with a severe intellectual disability and complex behaviours. This meant he could no longer access his carers, therapists, day programs, or any of his support services. This also meant his family were unable to attend or perform their usual occupations due to having to take on the role of full-time carers. Obviously, this was a high stress level for the family, and there were wellbeing and safety concerns for both the NDIS participant and for the family, given the extreme complex behaviours. This woman said that it meant limited access to the community because of these complex behaviours, and there were safety concerns for them. She was ringing the NDIA daily to try and get this addressed, but she didn't hear back. And again, in desperation, she had to turn to my office for support. Deputy Speaker, as I said, it shouldn't be like this. The NDIS is a great system. It could be an even better system that supports all of these families, that doesn't tie them up in red tape, that doesn't send them down a bureaucratic rabbit hole that they can't get out of without contacting their federal MP, that doesn't leave mothers lying awake at night thinking, well, which kid can I prioritise? What's the impact of my family? Are we all going to fall apart because I can't understand what's going on here? That doesn't mean that children are suddenly ripped away supports that they've had and families are left to deal with complex behaviours on their own. As I said, the NDIS is a great Labor legacy, but it should not be operating in the way it does under this Morrison government. It's an urgent problem and it does need to be addressed urgently. Unfortunately, again, in the past fortnight in Parliament, we've seen nothing from the Morrison government that would address any of these issues in the NDIS and in the way they operate the scheme. So I call on them today to do the work. Listen to the families that I'm sure are in communities on the other side as well. Make sure the system works as it should. It just shouldn't be this hard for all of these families. The NDIS should not be putting extra burden and extra complexity on people. Deputy Speaker, of course, it's not just the NDIS. We also know that aged care is in crisis in this country. And of course, once again, this government's response has been abysmal. Every elderly Australian should get quality care. All of the amazing people who are currently working in our aged care system should be supported. But that's not what's happening under this government. And in fact, this week, last week again from this government, have we been debating how we fix aged care? Has this government brought into this parliament urgent plans, urgent legislation for how we fix aged care? They have not. We got an announcement about the ADF needing to come in because the government had failed to fix the system we really are at crisis point. But now we know there's also an issue about the pace at which the ADF are being rolled out into nursing homes. And obviously using defence in nursing homes is a short-term plan. There is a deep structural problem in aged care at the moment, and that means that older people in these aged care facilities are not getting the dignified quality of life that they should. Deputy Speaker, I've spoken in this place before about one of the most heartbreaking things I've had to do as a local member was 2 years ago when I had to speak to families in my community who lost loved ones in aged care at that stage of the COVID pandemic. It was a horrible thing for me to have to do, but it was obviously devastating for those families to have to understand what had happened and why their loved ones had died. That was 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic. We've had 2 years. We've had an entire royal commission, and still this government fails aged care. This government seems comfortable with people dying in aged care. This government seems comfortable with people not being able to visit their loved ones for months and months because homes are locked down. This government seems comfortable with overstressed workers who are carrying a very, very difficult burden that they should just not have to if this government would do its job. Well, I want to assure everyone in my community, Labor gets this. We know that aged care is in crisis. We know that this system needs the attention and support that it should have, that families in my community should not be worrying about their parents in aged care. They should know that those parents are safe and are having the quality of life that they deserve. Aged care workers in my communities should not be doing 30-hour shifts, trying to run from bed to bed because there just aren't enough people in the facility. This is not acceptable. We talk a lot in this place about respecting older Australians, about the work they do to build this country. Well, the way we honour that, the way we recognise that, is to have an aged care system that works. I urge the Morrison government to make this a focus because Australians are watching. Australians know that you have failed, that you have left a system in crisis, and that more than 2 years into a pandemic, you have failed to make the changes we need. In fact, the minister responsible, instead of talking about what's going on in the system, the minister responsible went to the cricket, not just once, but for 3 days. Shame. Unbelievable, actually. Unbelievable if you think about, again, all the families in my electorate calling my office asking, can you help me get in and see my mum? I can't understand why I can't yet. I'm really worried because my dad hasn't had his booster shot yet and it's been pushed back for 3 weeks. Can you help me understand why? The minister wasn't providing my office with information around that. He was at the cricket. And this Prime Minister seems comfortable with that, despite being asked numerous times this week, last week in this parliament, whether he retains confidence in his Minister for Aged Care Services. Scott Morrison seems to be fine with that. He's not taking any action against that minister. Deputy Speaker, this points to a pattern from the Morrison government. A pattern of not looking out for everyone in our community. A pattern of not caring when the things that they are responsible for the things that we should be able to rely on in our community, break, when they haven't been up to the job. This government hasn't stepped in and worked it out. This Prime Minister hasn't held a hose. He hasn't done his job. And that effect is being felt still in all of our communities, in my community, with families lying awake at night, wondering what they're going to do with their young child with a disability, wondering how they're going to withstand the pressures that they're feeling at the moment. In my community, with families lying awake at night, wondering if their mum in aged care is safe, wondering when they'll be able to get in and see her again. This goes to the heart of what sort of country we want to be, of what sort of society we want to be. Do we want to be as a society where we leave people who are elderly, people who have disability on the edges? Or do we want to be a society that makes sure that everyone is treated with dignity, that all of us know that no matter what situation we end up in, we will be supported as we should be. We will have a government that cares for us, that understands that our community, our society functions best when we respect everyone in it. And most importantly, when we have a government that just does its job, that doesn't go to the cricket when there's an aged care crisis, that does hold a hose, that's not playing the ukulele and, pulling out family stunts for a 60-minute special. A government that is interested in what's going on in people's lives in Australia and is concentrated on making those lives better. That is what a Labor government will provide to this country. And that is why we need an Anthony Albanese Labor government to fix the mess this government's left us in.
Thank you. I call the member for I thank the member for Jaga Jaga, and I call the member for Dobell.
Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to follow my colleague, the member for Jaga Jaga, and echo her sentiments. No person should be lying awake at night worried about their elderly family member in aged care. No parent or caregiver should be distressed about the care and opportunities for their child living with a disability. It's something that, in a country like Australia, everyone deserves a fair go. Everybody should be treated with respect and dignity. And I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has really shone a light on is the existing disparities that we have in Australia. And they've only been amplified by this crisis, and the stark inequalities that we have within communities and between communities. My colleague here representing large parts of the Northern Territory, but we don't have to go so far as regional or remote Australia to see the problems that so many people have faced. In my community on the central coast of New South Wales, which is an hour and a half north of Sydney and an hour south of Newcastle, locals, business owners and families, they're just fed up with being neglected and left behind by this government. And this started well before the failures of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, well before the failures of quarantine, the Bungwood vaccine rollout and the desperate scramble for rapid antigen tests, because the government just didn't shore off enough supply. Under the Morrison government, after 8 years of this government, the north end of the Central Coast, where I represent, always seems to miss out when it comes to jobs, when it comes to road funding, when it comes to skills and training scholarships, when it comes to quality healthcare close to home, when it comes to aged care. The list goes on and on and on. Deputy Speaker, people in my community, they're hardworking people, they're capable, they've pulled together during this pandemic. But there's times when strong communities like mine need support, when they need a proper government that acts in their interests, where they're not left to a postcode lottery or a spreadsheet, deciding, who gets things and who doesn't. Deputy Speaker, how can we have a budget which has $1 trillion of debt, and yet people are dying alone and afraid in aged care, and yet young people with disability are having their NDIS plans slashed, where people who are looking for a secure place to live, who can't afford the rent? I mean, how can we have $1 trillion of debt and so many people, vulnerable people, at risk and left exposed by the decisions of this government? Communities like mine deserve better. Communities across Australia deserve better. They deserve a government that governs for everyone. They deserve a government underpinned by respect and empathy and dignity. They shouldn't be left like this. The most vulnerable people in our community, frail elderly, young people with disability, people looking for work, women fleeing family violence, they shouldn't be at risk and exposed because of the decisions or inaction of this government. In a country like Australia, everyone, wherever you are born, live, grow up and age, should have a fair go, should be able to live with dignity and respect, should have a fair shot at education and training, should have a secure job, should have the opportunity to have their own home and to be able to support their own family. And what do we need to see? This means access to quality education and training close to home. This means secure work, better conditions and a steady career. This means healthcare that you can afford when you need it, and aged care at the end of your life. And yet what we're seeing is the exact opposite. Deputy Speaker, for example, when it comes to road funding in my community or any infrastructure funding, we constantly miss out. And yet, according to the NRMA, the Central Coast has one of the worst infrastructure backlogs in New South Wales. And yet, at the same time, there are no local projects on Infrastructure Australia's priority list. The last major infrastructure project on the Central Coast was kicked off by the member for Grayndler when he was Infrastructure Minister. The last major infrastructure upgrade on the coast. In the 2021 budget, the Morrison government announced more than $3 billion in priority road projects across the coast, but not a single cent was spent in Wyong, Tuggerah or Warnervale. In the 2019-20 budget, close to $70 million was allocated to the so-called Central Coast Roads package. But a breakdown of the funding shows most of the money went to the neighbouring seat of Robertson, just south of my electorate. In fact, more than 90% of the funding went to roads in Robertson. Or if you did it per head, $419 per person in Robertson, but $39 per person was spent on roads in Dobell. Shame. The north end of the Central Coast is the growth region. The north end of the Central Coast is where we have young families and people ageing in place. The north end of the Central Coast has the biggest backlog of most regions in New South Wales, and yet what have we seen from this government? Just been overlooked and left behind. Meanwhile, locals are crying out for investment to fix the Pacific Highway through Wyong and Bryant Drive at Tuggerah, two major bottlenecks in my community which are in desperate need of an upgrade. Transport projects like these would ease congestion, improve safety and create more local jobs, and they'd open up employment zones across the Central Coast. But this government's sitting on its hands and failing to invest in my community, and it's local people that are bearing the brunt of this government's failure. Deputy Speaker, I mentioned before jobs and education. There are many people on the Central Coast, including young people, school leavers, looking for local jobs. Or if they've got a job, looking for more secure work or more hours or a certain roster. And at the same time, local businesses tell me they're looking to hire. But what everyone has said to me is that there aren't the affordable training opportunities close to home for people to gain the skills they need. I was talking to a young person I was on surf patrol with, and I asked him what he was doing, and he said, through COVID, he said, I dropped out of school in year 11, it just got too tough. He said, I've taken up a job with a local landscaper. And I said, do you have an apprenticeship? And he said, look, I'd really need to travel to Ryde to get the training I need. So right now, that's just not something that I can do. So why should a young person have to travel an hour and a half to do a TAFE course to pick up the skills he needs to be able to get a steady job, to have a good career, to be able to support himself and contribute to our community and the local economy? And the government protests, but they have cut $3 billion from TAFE over the past 8 years. My late father was a builder and an engineer and a TAFE teacher, and he was really proud of the quality of technical training that TAFE provided. He taught both at Ultimo, TAFE and closer to Newcastle. But what we've seen under this government and in New South Wales under the Liberal government, they have eroded skills and training across Australia, but especially seen in regional and remote communities. The cost for someone to be able to travel to training or to move to Sydney to be able to get those skills, they can't afford it on an apprentice's wage or on a traineeship. It just rules them out. It means, and that they, even though it just means that they don't have the same shot, that they don't have a fair go, and from the get-go. And the government also failed. I mean, they've spruiked JobKeeper and JobSeeker and the success, and they were pushed to do it, and lots of people were excluded. At the height of the pandemic, when work was scarce in my community, we were inundated with people who didn't meet the eligibility criteria because it was so narrow, who, even though they were eligible, couldn't access it when they needed it. I heard from a local hairdresser who was meant to open her business in June, when the peak of the pandemic on the Central Coast. She told me that she then had to use different credit cards and personal loans to be able to cover her costs, and then she ended up driving for Menulog. She's got 2 children at home, and she had, a business that was set up and ready to go, and that's what she had to do during COVID to get by, and she did it. She's hardworking, she's a capable person, and now her business is open and doing well. But that was her experience, and that was avoidable. The distress because of the financial insecurity was avoidable. And for so many people like her, businesswomen across Australia. So instead of making it easier for people to access the training they need or the support they need to upskill, to get into the job market or to progress in their career, they're only making it harder for people. And it's just not good enough. Deputy Speaker, we have to fix this. We need to fix this. Communities like mine, anyone living outside of a big city, whether it's in the outer suburbs, the regions or remote Australia, they need better than this. The government needs to make it easier for people to find work, for communities to get the funding they need, and for locals to access quality healthcare. Before I was elected, I worked at Wyong Hospital in my community on the Central Coast of New South Wales, and I just want to say at this time, the government has praised health workers, they've commended them, but do you know what healthcare workers tell me? They say the time for cupcakes and applause is over. What they need is proper pay and conditions. What they need is proper support to be able to do their jobs. I heard from a father recently who spoke to me about his daughter, who has had to leave nursing. Someone who loved her job, who saw it, she was dedicated to supporting people and caring for them and working within our local community. And she's now receiving counselling and mental health support at the moment, and I understand she's doing better. But because of the conditions that she had to work under, because of a role she had to step up to because other people weren't able to do it, she's ended up in a mental health crisis. And this is avoidable. How can our government and our health minister or our aged care minister say how much they value aged care workers, disability support workers, healthcare workers, and at the same time underpay them or have them working in conditions that are not safe for the people that they're trying to care for the people that they're working with? It's just a risk, and it has to change. It just cannot go on for people in my community or other communities like it. We need a government that genuinely cares about people. Someone said to me recently that they were reflecting on the government and its decision-making, and they said to me, they just don't have any empathy. They said they just don't seem to care. And if you don't care and you don't notice people struggling, how are you going to be able to do anything about it? What people in my community want is what anyone wants. They want to be able to have, a place to live, a roof over their head. They want their children to be able to have a good education close to home. They want to be able to see a future in communities like mine, where communities are thriving. And in my community, our people are its strength. But there are times when even strong communities need support. And this is one of those times. We're going into the 3rd year of a pandemic. People are exhausted, they're burnt out, they're vulnerable. Some of them are alone and afraid. And what has this government done? They've neglected them. they've abandoned them. People, when they most need a government, the government saying, oh, we need to get government out of the way. What people need is a good government that acts in their interests, that provides the proper support that they need. Under a future Labor government, Australia will be a country where everyone has a fair go, where wherever you live or born or grow up, you'll have a chance. Under a future Labor government, we'll be a country that makes things again. I met with a machinist recently, and he took me into his workshop and he showed me the things that they used to make, including a weigh scale that they made for shopping centres. And he said to me, I've been working as a machinist for 40 years. He said, we had quality training. We had the most capable and skilled technical people. And he's in this workshop just kind of by himself. You know, and we've got workshops like that and people like him across Australia. We used to be a country that made things. We're a country that trained technical and skilled people. And we should have that opportunity again. After almost a decade of sending manufacturing offshore and neglecting Australian workers under this government, Labor has a plan to bring things back to our shores. I mean, we once had a proud tradition of manufacturing industry, creating thousands of local jobs. In a community like mine, we had a history of, food and beverage manufacturing. We've got companies like Sanitarium, Masterfoods, Kellogg's. What they need is a government that invests in them so that we can see an expansion and growth in jobs, especially outside of big cities. A Labor government will establish a Future Made in Australia office because we want to prioritise Australian businesses. As I mentioned, there are so many talented, capable, motivated people living in communities like mine across Australia that just haven't been given a shot. They haven't been given a fair go. And that's what they need. They need a government that will back them in. A Labor government will also provide 465,000 free TAFE places to encourage people to study in areas where there's a skills shortage. Like the young man that I was talking to you about on Surf Patrol. You know, he deserves the opportunity to be able to have a quality TAFE course that he can afford close to home to get the skills that he needs. He shouldn't be forced to get on a train to Sydney he couldn't afford to move to Sydney. People like him deserve a fair go. Deputy Speaker, what Australians need is a plan for the future, and one that brings all Australians together, where wherever you're born, live, grow up or age, you have a fair shot. And you know that you can rely on a government that acts in your best interests. We need a change of government.
I thank the member for Dobell and I call the member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased to be able to speak on these appropriation bills. As is always the case, Labor is not in the habit of blocking supply. We, of course, will be supporting these bills, but this is an opportunity to put on record the disappointment of my community in the failure of the Morrison government to act in both following good governance principles, and I'll come to that in a minute, but also failing to deliver on what are the core areas of concern for people living in my community. Certainly this is a government that has been just racked with stories of mismanagement, improprieties, wastefulness and, outright corruption, where there are allegation after allegation around the way in which government's making decisions and appropriating funds accordingly. We've seen the colossal distress caused by robo-debt in our communities, again where the government's simply not acting legally, and followed up by car rorts and a whole lot of other inappropriate uses of funds. It's not just wasteful to expend public money in such a shoddy manner, it is downright insulting to people in communities like Newcastle that seem to constantly miss out on this government's, they're blinded by their blinkers. One such organisation I want to go to now was caught in the middle of the despicable behaviour that we now identify as sports rorts. The Newcastle Olympic Football Club is one of the many sporting organisations that got dudded by this government's infamous sports rorts, cheated out of $500,000 despite their hard work and excellent submission, which an independent assessment gave them a very high score, much higher than many others, and one that would have ordinarily enabled them to be granted the funds. But we watched those in government-held seats get funding who received much lesser scores indeed. If the government had done the right thing then, the Newcastle Olympic Football Club would have had their upgraded facilities by now, instead of having to spend years now securing money from other sources, whilst all the while watching construction costs absolutely skyrocketing, so that this project is going to be infinitely more expensive now than it was when they put their first proposal in. For what I must say is much-needed upgrade of their facilities. The Newcastle Olympic Football Club has been selected as a training venue for the FIFA 2023 Women's World Cup, which is great, but that is in doubt because of this shameful rorting of public money. Any club that's trying to increase women's sporting participation should be rewarded, in my view, not ripped off by a government addicted to rorting and skewing public funds. I think another example of that really has been the use of the Building Better Regions funds. We know that in the most recent round there was some $300 million of funding available, but $270 million of that went into coalition and marginal held seats. These rorts prevent great shovel-ready projects from proceeding that should, on any kind of merits-based assessment, get the tick. So I deeply regret that projects in my electorate, like the $8.5 million for revitalisation of the Victorian Theatre, seems to have been completely overlooked, the $2.5 million Small Business Support Centre, that is absolutely needed in my community now, again missed out on funding altogether. You would think in a post-COVID reconstruction phase that shovel-ready projects that had widespread community support, great cost-benefit analysis, would have been rewarded by this government, but that has sadly not been the case. Another matter that I want to bring to the attention of the House is just that how appalling it is that we find ourselves in 2022 being unable to use mobile phones in our homes if you live in certain parts of even Newcastle, the second largest city in New South Wales that has the northern part of Stockton. I continue to get complaints from constituents unable to make use of their smartphones, which we all know we're increasingly reliant upon every day. It astonishes me. It absolutely astonishes me. But it is in keeping with the complete botching of the whole rollout of telecommunications in this country under this government. We've seen the complete botch of the National Broadband Network Scheme. It will take a new government, a Labor Albanese government, to remedy what has been a far from satisfactory attempt to use multiple kinds of technology to patch together what should have been one of the biggest nation-building projects Australia had seen, delivering remarkable results for people wherever you live in Australia. That was the intent. But as I said, people like Mr William Snow, who has been in my electorate office trying to get support for the failure for this apparent black spot in the northern parts of Stockton in Newcastle. But the Morrison government's black spot program, of course, doesn't cover people in my community. It's their own program to rectify these problems excludes communities like Stockton from being eligible. So it is a pity that we do not see a stronger commitment to ensuring that telecommunications, whether it is phone services or internet services, are the very best they can be wherever you live in Australia. Heaven help those that are living in far, remote, rural parts of Australia if you can't get good telecommunications in Australia's New South Wales's second largest city. I'd also like to touch on a matter that has been, very distressing for my community, and that is the terrible difficulties that Afghani refugees are having in trying to seek entrance into Australia. Like many Australians, I watched with horror as we saw the Taliban resume control of Kabul. I had many, many distressed people in my electorate, Afghani Australians, defence personnel who had served alongside of Afghani men and women, and I share their pain and their heartache. It's almost 6 months now since people fled Kabul in those, those scenes of apparent trauma, distress, and just an absolute emergency, a state of emergency. And Afghani Australians are especially distraught, as visa applications that they have submitted for their loved ones who are in life-threatening situations have not even received acknowledgement from the Department of Immigration yet. 6 months after the return of the Taliban to power, no humanitarian visas have been granted by the Australian government. And the government said that they would prioritise visa applications for those with links to people with links to Australia, women and children, but I have literally hundreds of my constituents contacting me who have submitted urgent visa applications for their family members, but have been completely left in the dark by this government. The government has not acted with urgency. A few weeks ago, after a scathing Senate committee report criticised the government's lack of action, the government announced that it would be allocating 15,000 visas to Afghan nationals. But what was missing from that headline was the fact that the allocation would be made over the next 4 years, and that the humanitarian visas would come out of an already existing annual humanitarian program of 13,750. I also understand that 4,300 Afghans evacuated in August last year will also be counted as part of the 15,000 humanitarian places over the next 4 years. So this government announcement, like so many, when you scratch beneath the surface, we find that it actually reduces the number of newly allocated places. This announcement completely fails to address the urgent need for an expansion of protective resettlement of Afghans who are in imminent danger from the Taliban regime. The Australian government can and must do so much more for the people of Afghanistan, for so many Afghans who risk their lives serving alongside of our ADF personnel. A 4-year wait under a Taliban rule will have lethal consequences, and they should be able to come and join their families in Australia. That was the priority made by this government, and it should be honoured. In the time remaining, I'd just like to touch on 2 other issues. One is around GP shortages in my electorate and the crisis in housing. In 1975, it was the Whitlam government, of course, that made the historic introduction of universal health care to Australia to ensure that there would be, that your access to health care was never reliant on some kind of postcode lottery or dependent on the amount of money you had in your bank account. Ever since, however, we have seen ongoing efforts by consecutive Conservative governments trying to chip away at the universality of our health care. Well, recent cuts to bulk billing incentives and Medicare rebates, alongside of the despicable closure of a GP access after hours service that was attached to the Calvary Mater Hospital in my electorate on Christmas Eve. These have resulted in devastating impacts for people in my community. Time and time again, people of Newcastle tell me they cannot find a bulk billing GP. That is a direct result of the withdrawal of the bulk billing incentive payments by the Morrison government. People who can afford to go to a non-bulk billing doctor tell me that they can't actually get an appointment to see their doctor. Well, that again is a direct result of the Morrison government's decision to remove areas like Newcastle and the Hunter region from the distribution priority area classification list. It's made it extremely difficult for local medical practices to recruit and retain doctors. I know the Fletcher Clinic in my electorate is one of many GP clinics across Newcastle affected by this decision. Madison, the practice manager at the Fletcher Clinic, told me they are in desperate need of a new doctor. They are working overtime to meet demand, which has only been made worse by the pandemic. They are concerned that they can't meet existing need, but there's a whole new housing developed proposal for Minmire and other new housing areas that are proceeding in the district that will bring increased demand. They already have 6,500 patients on their books today. This reckless act by the Morrison government will just simply add to further health inequality in Australia. And it certainly wouldn't happen if it was on the North Shore of Sydney, or might I say the Sutherland Shire. Finally, Deputy Speaker, I want to touch on the fact that Australia, but Newcastle in particular, is facing a housing crisis. Novocastrians are now waiting 5 to 10 years on social housing wait lists. 31% of public housing dwellings in New South Wales don't meet basic minimal standards. They're the worst result in the country, in fact. The system, there's a system where almost 1/3 of public housing households live in dirty and unsafe conditions now. In the last 12 months, private rentals have increased in my electorate by nearly $5,000 in suburbs like Mayfield West. Nurses, teachers and tradies can't take up jobs in our regions because they can't find places to live. Open houses become more like mosh pits because families can't find a place to call home. Police needed to be called to manage the chaos of crowds of up to 200 people desperate to inspect a property. The system is broken. For nearly a decade, this Liberal government's ignored the urgent need for social and affordable housing, saying it's not our problem. Well, it is. We need national leadership. No more delays, no more excuses, Mr Morrison. Now's the time to fix Australia's housing crisis.
The member's time has expired, and I thank the member for Newcastle, and I call the member for Adelaide.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I too wish to speak on this appropriation bill. It's an opportunity to talk about the spending of the government, but also look at areas where it isn't being spent properly or areas where it should have been spent as well. Deputy Speaker, when we look at this government, the Morrison government, it's all about a distraction, and we see the last 2 weeks of Parliament where there could be an election called in March at some stage, so it's the end of this parliamentary session. And you'd think the government would come to this place with bills that had a bit of vision for Australia, the betterment of our next generation of Australians, a better plan for pensioners, a better plan for creating jobs, and some good infrastructure that creates jobs, local jobs. But instead what we've seen in the last 2 weeks of Parliament is bills that have been divisive. Wedge politics and issues that do not betterment this country. And it's all about distraction, as I said, instead of taking action on the things that matter to Australians. We deserve an economy that works for the Australian people and not the other way round. Deputy Speaker, this country deserves a government that actually puts them first and not the politics first, and that's all we've seen here in the last 2 weeks. Also, Deputy Speaker, we see that the last 2 weeks has been a tirade on the Leader of the Opposition, Anthony Albanese, all sorts of things about fiscal responsibility, that he hasn't had a Treasury position, and a range of other things. So what I want to just basically say is that this side, our side of politics, the Labor Party, we shouldn't be lectured on fiscal responsibility from the most wasteful government since Federation. And we shouldn't be lectured by a government that doubled the debt before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, the debt had been doubled. Deputy Speaker, despite the rhetoric from the other side or from the government, it is one of the highest taxing governments of the last 30 years and is now collecting approximately $4,500 more from each Australian than when Labor was last in government in 2013. That's $4,500 more on average of every single Australian since Labor was in government in 2013. And when you look at their track record and their history over the last 3 years, they've had some major failings. They failed on the vaccine rollout. They didn't deliver one new single federal quarantine facility. They didn't order enough rapid antigen tests. And they presided over a crisis in aged care and disappeared when workers and small businesses needed help the most. And I spoke to many of my small businesses in my electorate in Adelaide, as many of you would have, and they were telling me of the trials and tribulations they were having and the difficult times. We saw the government splash around billions of dollars on JobKeeper payments to businesses, and many did quite well out of it, whose revenue increased in billions of dollars. Deputy Speaker, we saw businesses whose takings tripled, yet they still receive billions of dollars in JobKeeper. Deputy Speaker, the failures aren't limited to budgetary matters either. We know that the economy is suffering under this government's watch. Productivity has been flatlining, and poor productivity performance means a smaller economy, growing smaller than it could be, and another decade of failed productivity targets would leave very hard-working Australians, Australian families, worse off. So what does the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, this government, something that they'll never understand is that you can't rot and waste your way to productivity growth. To really get productivity moving, we need investment in energy, technology, infrastructure and human capital. In people and not politics. We need investment in infrastructure that will propel our economy forward, like cleaner and cheaper energy, and an NBN that will underpin our digital economy. We need a plan to train people through the TAFE system, university systems, and more university places to fill skill shortages now and into the future. Last week I met with Engineers Australia, and they tell me there is not a single course in this country for nuclear engineers. Not a single course in this country. And on the other hand, we're talking about building nuclear-powered submarines. Who's going to do it? And there's no plan in place. There is no training facility. There is nowhere that someone can train as a nuclear engineer to be able to work on the submarines, the nuclear-powered submarines. Deputy Speaker, we cannot afford another decade like this. This government has just looked at quick fixes, at point scoring and political fixes, not fixes to get this country on its feet to be a power in the future. When you look at different areas, and pensioners is an area I've spoken about many times in this place, this government has a very bad track record on supporting pensioners. We've become used to seeing the government try and chip away at people's age pensions ever since they've been in government. When we look at them, that's all that they've done when it comes to pension policies. Pensions that people have worked very hard to receive in the course of their working lives. Pensioners who have worked hard and contributed to our economy and our society all their lives. Deputy Speaker, when Labor was last in government, there was an actual increase of $30 on top of CPIs, on top of other increases that come natural throughout the course of the year, an actual increase. Now, over the last 7 years, this government's track record has been to cut, or they've tried to cut the pension time and time again, and it's on the record. In 2014, in their first budget, they tried to cut the pension indexation, And as I've said, that cut would have meant pensioners would have been forced to live on $80 less a week within 10 years. In that same year, they cut $1 billion from pensioner concessions. Then they axed the $900 seniors supplement to self-funded retirees receiving the Commonwealth Healthcare Card. In 2015, they did a deal with the Greens to cut the pension to around 370,000 pensioners by as much as $12,000 a year by changing the pension assets test. Now, the pension assets test, since it came into fruition, has always been increased, not decreased. In other words, the amount that you can have in assets in terms to receive the pension, because cost of living goes up and everything goes up with it. This was the first government that actually decreased it, brought it down, which affected, as I said, 370,000 pensioners, many in my electorate, Deputy Speaker, that perhaps had very small assets and were receiving a part pension and a part income from some of those very small assets. At the same time, they tried to cut the pension for over 1.5 million Australians by scrapping the energy supplement for pensioners. Deputy Speaker, the list goes on and on. We look at another debacle that's taken place, and that is the NDIS, and we've heard other speakers speak about the NDIS in this place earlier. When we introduced the NDIS, it was the only national scheme of its kind in the world, something to be very proud of. It was designed to revolutionise disability care and put choice, dignity at the forefront for people living with disabilities. It was the envy of the world. But since coming into office, this Liberal Morrison government has done nothing but undermine the scheme through $4.6 billion being ripped out of the NDIS, people receiving services, for example, that they don't need, and I hear this all the time in my electorate, and being denied the services that they actually require to live with dignity, difficult, complicated application processes and review processes, and 1,200 Australians with disability dying while waiting to be funded by the scheme. Deputy Speaker, this is a government that has no real interest in the NDIS. If they did, they'd be fixing it. This would be a bill that would be before the House of how to better the NDIS, not the wedge politics that we've been seeing over the last few weeks. Deputy Speaker, it takes me on to this being an appropriations bill. It's obviously about funding and monetary policies, and it takes me on to infrastructure. Now, the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison governments have made a mockery in my electorate of the north-south motorway. They've been delaying money in every budget since 2013, and I've got to say it was a Labor initiative. I was there with the Leader of the Opposition, Anthony Albanese, in 2013 when we turned the first sod. It was a Labor initiative. And we see the Prime Minister fly into Adelaide last weekend to make a commitment for the north-south freeway. But South Australians have woken up to this government, Deputy Speaker. We can't trust that this money will ever come, let alone when it's promised for, as has been the history since 2013 when they came into government. How many more times will the government re-announce funding for this project instead of actually getting on with delivering it? Infrastructure projects are key to job creators. They are key. If you want to create jobs and boost the economy, it's done through good infrastructure, and this government has dismally failed on this. Yet construction of this final passage of the north-south corridor has come to a standstill, Deputy Speaker. Last year, leaked documents by members of the state Liberal government show that South Australian Road upgrade, the South Road upgrade, that north-west corridor upgrade, may not be completed until possibly 2035. 2035, a decade later than it was originally planned by Labor. This means that we could experience 5 federal elections, 4 Olympic Games before this upgrade is complete. And this means greater uncertainty for businesses, the residents, people who are being left in limbo at a time when business confidence is an all-time low, Deputy Speaker. We have seen a government, again, that plays the politics and the wedge politics instead of having bills before this House, in this cycle of Parliament, to better the economy, to make Australia a better country. They're more interested in politics than the betterment of this nation. Healthcare and Medicare are another important area that this government has neglected. And the pandemic has shown us how important our healthcare system is. But this government can't be trusted with it. It recently launched its biggest attack on Medicare in decades. And to use the recent Victorian COVID-19 outbreak to sneak in almost 1,000 changes to the Medicare benefit schedule is just wrong on so many levels. These changes would radically alter the cost of hundreds of orthopaedic, cardiac and general surgery items. And the Morrison government's plan to cut Medicare rebates means patients must choose between cancelling life-changing surgeries or be hit with huge bills that they can't afford to pay, or bills that they were never told about. And many are finding that surprise when they do go for surgery. Deputy Speaker, it's estimated in South Australia that they're paying around 33% more out of pocket for non-referral visits compared to 2013. Deputy Speaker, we've seen a government that from 2013, when they were elected, have a vision for this nation, but their only vision is that they stay in power. That's their number one goal. And as I said, at the cycle of the 3-year term, when we should be seeing debates in this place and bills about our education system, about bettering our training systems, about healthcare, about pensioners, giving them some certainty and some dignity in their lives. We're seeing the typical wedge politics and scaremongering and the division that they want to create in the community through the most important thing that they thought that they could discuss in these last few weeks in these bills that they've brought to this House. Australians are smarter than that. Australians know that the things that keep this country going and the things that matter to them are education for their kids, a good healthcare system when they need it, and to have secure work. They're the three things that this nation requires at this moment. And this government is more interested in playing politics and basically keeping themselves in power at any cost. Deputy Speaker, we've seen over the last decade that they've been in government many failures. And one of the biggest failures has been this pandemic. As I said, there has been not one single facility built for quarantine. When all the advice coming from the health bureaucrats and the experts was that we need a facility to house people when they come into this country at that period of time. We saw the spread of the pandemic. And yes, we did do better than most nations at the beginning, but when you see the things that were put in place or weren't put in place, like, for example, the rapid tests, which I wrote personally to the Health Minister back in May last year, suggesting that we have rapid tests, and the answer came back as a no. Deputy Speaker, we have a government, unfortunately, who is interested in politics and securing their own future, not Australia's future.
I thank the member for Adelaide and call the member for Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today, on the front page of The Australian, tells a story of how across the nation 700 BHP workers are facing the sack. 700 Australians being thrown out of their jobs. And yet, Madam Deputy Speaker, we hardly hear a whimper about this from either side of politics. Where is the party of the workers that say they stand for the workers of this country? Where are they arguing for those 700 BHP workers that are being sacked, not for poor job performance, or not because anything that they've done wrong, because they've decided to exercise what should be their right in a democratic society as to whether you participate in a medical experiment, whether you undertake a medical intervention, should be your free choice in a democracy. Your job should not be dependent or held hostage because you haven't decided to participate in that medical experiment. 700 workers today across the nation are being thrown out of BHP. And that is on top of the tens of thousands of workers that have already lost their jobs. Teachers, nurses, doctors, paramedics, retail workers, truck drivers, across all sectors of our economy. People being thrown out of work because they have simply decided to exercise what must be a free right in a democratic society. No democratic society should mandate the injection of a substance into your body just to keep your job. And in many cases, this is more than just people's jobs. This is people's careers that are being thrown out. Teachers that are losing their job, and not only losing their job as a teacher, they're losing their career. Ambulance officers and paramedics that we rely upon are today sitting on the sidelines of our economy because they've decided not to get injected with one of these experimental COVID vaccines. This is a shameful day for our nation. But what is even more shameful is that the lack of people in this parliament that are speaking up and using their voice against it. The economy is not going that well that we can afford 700 mining workers in BHP to be no longer working in that industry. What, we're looking down the barrel of something like a $1.4 trillion debt, and we're telling these people that they cannot participate in the economy? The party of the workers, silent about these workers losing their jobs. Absolutely silent. It's hard to know what's worse. Those in this parliament that actually think that the government and big industry and big medical and big pharma and the bureaucrats in here in Canberra know better and should force you against your free will to be injected. And they think that's okay, that a society where your freedoms are all held hostage to the point of a needle, that those that think it's okay. But equally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the number of people in this House that know in their heart that that is wrong, that know in their conscience that that is wrong, but yet come to this parliament and say nothing about it. To mandate an injection, to mandate a medical intervention, and remember, not just any old medical intervention, a medical intervention with an mRNA vaccine, a substance that has never been injected into humans before, that we have no long-term safety data for, is not only unethical, immoral, a breach of human rights, but it is simply done un-Australian. And more of us need to use our voice to stick up against it. And what's even worse, Madam Deputy Speaker, there may have been an argument 6 months ago, 12 months ago, when we had all those experts stand up and they say, well, if you get injected, you can't catch COVID and you can't spread it on. That was what was told to the general public, where they took on 98% and plus, 90% plus efficacies. That's what we were promised. That's what this was sold upon. We now know that is completely untrue. Not only untrue, but if we look to see how idiotic and how stupid these mandates are and how counterproductive they are, just look at the latest data out of the United Kingdom. The official UK Health Security Agency, their weekly COVID-19 vaccine surveillance report for week 6 of the year, 10th of February, just have a look at what that data shows. Now, you'd think these mandates would mean that you've been injected, that you are less likely to have COVID. That is the entire premise behind it. But look what the data shows. We look at the rates of cases reported between week 2 of 2022 and week 5, a 4-week period. In the UK, of those 30 to 39, there was a 4.9% COVID positive rate amongst those that were injected not once, not twice, but 3 times. 4.9% infection rate over that month amongst those injected 3 times. But those not injected at all, those that are vaccine-free, that are supposedly have a higher rate of COVID, it's actually just over 2%. So the rates of infection in the UK in the 30 to 39-year-old age bracket are less than half amongst those that are vaccine-free as compared to those that have been not once, not twice, but 3 times jabbed. 140% difference. It's the same for the 49-year-old age group, where there's 172% greater probability of having COVID if you've been injected 3 times as compared to a vaccine-free person. And for my age bracket, those in the 50 to 59-year-olds, a 2.6% infection rate with those injected 3 times. But for those not injected, those vaccine-free, just 1.167%. 120% higher rate of infections amongst the triple jabbed than amongst those that are vaccine-free. With that data, how can anyone possibly mandate these injections? It should be a free choice in a free society. And yet here we have thousands of Australians. We saw them here on the weekend. The largest protest ever in this nation's history. People protesting just for the right to work in a free democratic society. We have taken that right away from them. We have the constitutional power here in this parliament to end these insane, illogical, unethical, immoral, un-Australian mandates. We have the constitutional power here today to end them if we wanted to. But sadly, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are so many in this parliament that are happy to see these mandates go ahead because they think that it gives them some extra protection. They are prepared to sell out the human rights of other Australians because they think they might get some benefit from it. They think it may somehow be not popular. We've got to stand up for what is right in this parliament. And it is not right that 700 Australians are losing their jobs today, 700 BHP workers. It is not right that teachers are being told they can't go back to the classroom to teach in front of their children because they have decided to be vaccine-free. It is not right when our hospitals around the nation are in chaos and the queues are lengthening that we have paramedics and ambulance officers stood down, unable to work in the hospital system because they have decided to be vaccine-free. I would hope that more members of this parliament would speak up. I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, at the moment this is not popular. But let me tell you, history will judge us on the decisions that we are making. History will record that this parliament stood by and did nothing. And history will condemn this parliament for those actions. Parliament will stand in the years to come. They will look back upon this parliament, look upon the actions of every single member of this parliament and say, what did you do to stand up and fight against those illogical abuses of human rights, those vaccine mandates? Sadly, there's very few of us, Madam Deputy Speaker, that will be able to say that we've stood by to fight the good fight. We weren't concerned about the attacks upon us in the media because we called it out what our conscience saw. And my conscience tells me that it is completely and utterly wrong what is happening. It's contrary to everything that I believe in. Freedom of choice, freedom of bodily autonomy. If you don't have the freedom to decide what substances that you'll inject into your body, what's the point of any other freedoms? Our freedoms of medical choice, our freedoms of economic opportunity, our freedoms of personal travel are all subject and dependent and interlinked. When we break one, we break them all. The election, there's only a few days left, sitting days of this parliament. I hope in the month's break that we have before the budget week, that many other members of parliament will look into their conscience, will look deep into their conscience and speak out how wrong this is and stand up for those Australian workers. Every Australian worker that has been sacked from these vaccine mandates must have their job back. We can do it in this parliament if only we have the courage.
I thank the member for Hughes. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. All those that appear say aye, those against no. I think the ayes have it. Clerk.
Second reading. A bill for an act to appropriate additional money out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the ordinary annual services of the government and for related purposes.
No member wishes to consider the bill in detail. I will put the report question immediately. The question is that this bill be reported to the House without amendment. Those of that opinion say aye, those against no. I think the ayes have it. Clerk.
Government Business Order of the Day number 2, Appropriation Bill number 4, 2021-2022, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. All those that opinion say aye, those against no. I think the ayes have it. Clerk.
Second reading, a bill for an act to appropriate additional money out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for certain expenditure and for related purposes.
If no member wishes to consider the bill in detail, I will put the report question immediately. The question is that this bill be reported to the House without amendment. All those of that opinion say aye, those against no. I think the ayes have it. Clerk. Oh, I beg your pardon, yes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I move that the Federation Chamber do now adjourn.
I second the motion. Thank you. And I call the member for Solomon.
Thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the adjournment, I want to touch on a couple of local issues, some national issues, regional and international issues. So I'll be moving quick. I am so proud to live in the place that I do and to represent the people of Darwin and Palmerston. I'm so proud to represent Darwin and Palmerston.
Yes, order. A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions.
And I call the member for Solomon in continuation.
Yeah, thanks, Deputy Speaker, in continuation, and thanks for jumping in the chair. I was talking about how awesome my electorate of Solomon is, Greater Darwin, Darwin and Palmerston. My key focus is make sure the Territorians have got good jobs, good secure jobs, and we've also got great infrastructure in terms of roads, and we'll be having more to say about roads in the lead up to the election. Good health services, and that includes First Nations health services, and good social infrastructure, sports infrastructure, and unfortunately some of the commitments to our electorate from the coalition federal government that were made in terms of sports infrastructure, not a dollar has come to the football NT for new soccer, women's change rooms, for example. So I want to see the commitments that have been made honoured. And when it comes to cultural infrastructure, I'm a big supporter of the Larrakia Cultural Centre, which is going to be amazing down at the waterfront. Just touching on a couple of national issues, I want to congratulate the member for Hunter, Joel Fitzgibbon, for his fine service to our party and to this parliament. He gave a great and really excellent and honest speech this morning in the other place, in the other chamber. And I too believe, like he does, that we need to use the full capacity of our young people in this nation. There is nothing as dispiriting for young people to be born into intergenerational unemployment when we need to be giving them all the support that we can. People struggle for all sorts of reasons. It's not always people's fault that they can't get into employment, but for young kids, we need to give them every help that we can. I am a big fan of the idea of a national youth scheme, call it a national community service scheme, where we get young people and they do some residential training so they can learn how to do first aid, fight a fire, get some good life skills, and then they're placed out in the community. They might be working in a seniors' home, they might be surf lifesaving, they might go off and join the military, but they might be backing up our local fireys or paramedics. I'm really excited that Disaster Relief Australia is launching in my electorate in the next few weeks, and I would see them being a great organisation to train young Australians and to give them some skills, some good life skills to send them on their way. I want to thank Territorians for their ongoing work during the pandemic. It has been a difficult time, and also welcome the arrival of the Novavax vaccine. I hope that this provides an option for those who have been not willing to get vaccinated to this point. I think we will need to reconcile as a community and as a nation. We'll need to bring the country together, and that's what I see Federal Labor's role is after the next federal election, is to reintegrate people, reconnect people, and I look forward to being part of that. It's going to be very, very exciting. Just quickly, in the Indo-Pacific, something our relationships in the region I'm very passionate about. I want to thank the Labor leader for giving me the job of the Indo-Pacific Trade Task Force in this term. I'm very focused on working through from the subcontinent through ASEAN and into the Pacific. In particular, tomorrow morning I'll be speaking at Charles Darwin University in Darwin, opening an Understanding Indonesia conference, and I'm really passionate about seeing a peace park in Bali established to remember those 88 Australians and others who were killed in the Bali bombing, which is 20 years coming up. The bombing of Darwin 80 years ago, it's great that the Labor leader will be coming to Darwin. I look forward to connecting with Territorians out and about this weekend at those really important celebrations. Thanks, Deputy Speaker.
Member's time has expired and I call the member for Groom.
Thank you very much, Speaker. It's just a couple of days past a year since I made my maiden speech in the other chamber. Very kind words, thank you. And I think it takes you some time to work out how you can best help your community from your work in this place. And I will make mention of the member for Hunter, who was a valuable source, I'm very happy to say, for a young parliamentarian coming in trying to work out what to do. And I think of my home area, what best use federal government can make of its time investing and helping the Toowoomba region grow. It's been very clear to me that expanding our defence economy in the Toowoomba region is a fantastic opportunity for us to capitalise on. I think of the Railway Parklands project that's been so well supported by the Council, it's been so well supported by the Chamber of Commerce, and of course the second road to Highfields, a magnificent opportunity to link up that growth area. But we need help. We need help. We need help from the state government, very clearly on two key issues. We've got a hospital that's in desperate need of complete repair. We need a new hospital built, and we need passenger rail. And the federal government have put money towards a study for that. We need to work closely with the state government to deliver these, and it's important when it comes to infrastructure that we get it right. And this brings me to the point of the quarantine facility at Wellcamp that's made the news so much recently. When I first spoke on this issue, I was not fundamentally against a regional quarantine facility. What I wanted to know was what the plan was, because I knew that my hospitals, my police, my emergency services, my mayor and my council had not been included in these conversations, and that they were asking me to represent them in this place, to make sure that they were listened to. And we kept that all the way through, and I think that seeing that there was that ask from the community, what is the plan, how will this impact us? This was an important question, and it was never answered. Even today, it still remains unanswered. But at some stage through this process, the Premier of Queensland decided to go it alone. But the Feds acknowledged there was a need, and it's a very important need, for us to have future quarantine facilities, and appropriate ones. And it's a good point, and there was the opportunity to work together strongly on this point. Sadly, I think at this point, and I speak with greatest respect to those involved, this became largely a political issue rather than one of health. And that's very sad, because the losers in that were the people of Toowoomba, who were wondering where these nurses were going to come from, where the extra police were going to come from, how this was going to impact our community, particularly in the height of the Delta outbreak. This was an important series of questions we wanted to know. And unfortunately, it became a political issue because it benefited the Labor Party here in Canberra and in Brisbane. And I don't ever believe at that point it was done for the betterment of Toowoomba, or that Toowoomba's safety or concerns were being listened to. And now, quite frankly, I take absolutely no pleasure whatsoever in watching what's playing out across the televisions and newspapers around the country, telling a story of farce on our doorstep, of a 500-bed facility being filled with 38, but don't worry, there's one more on the way. We'll have 39 shortly, and another 500 beds to be built. And this is the story of the Toowoomba region that's being told. And forgive me, this is not worthy of Toowoomba. We have a fantastic opportunity to grow as a city, to become the inland port, thanks to Inland Rail, and I recognise the hard work done on this side of the House to establish us in that role. I think of the great opportunities that come from all the wonderful work done on the Warrego that have linked us into Brisbane, and what Toowoomba can be, feeding South East Queensland. We can't do this again. We can't do this again where we invest a lot of money in a facility that is going to be underutilised and returned very, very quickly to private ownership with no fundamental benefit to Toowoomba, and not addressing the needs that Toowoomba has in front of it. As I say, we have a hospital that needs to be built. We have passenger rail. It's incredible to think you can't catch a train from Brisbane to Toowoomba, but that is where we are, and these problems remain unaddressed. But there's 460-odd beds built on a soon-to-be private facility, doing nothing for anybody.
Thank you. And I call the member for Cowan.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, Cowan is an incredibly diverse electorate, which truly reflects modern Australia. And when I think of those words in our anthem, you know, that line, for those who've come across the seas, we've boundless plains to share. It's not just about the multitude of citizenship ceremonies that I attend and get to greet those who have called Australia home. It's also about the character of the Cowan electorate. And I want to acknowledge the diversity in Cowan, and I want to acknowledge those communities in Cowan and thank them, not just for sharing their culture through their food and through their music with me, but also for their loyalty to this country and for their achievements. Many of them have achieved really amazing things despite challenges and despite adversity. Over the last month, I've been really blessed to be able to attend a lot of cultural celebrations by cultural groups in Cowan. And I just want to go through some of them. I want to give a shout out to Joe Tuazama and Dr. Casti from the Organisation of African Communities. Just last month, I attended the Jambo African Festival at the Wanneroo Showgrounds. And wow, what a spectacular festival that was. It showcased not just the talent of the various African communities in Cowan, but also showcased their achievements and the ways in which they've really integrated into Australia in the political, social and economic life of Australia. Just before that, there was the very first Kenyan festival, also held at the Wanneroo Showgrounds. And, you know, my brothers and sisters from the Kenyan community welcomed my husband David and I with open arms, and it was such a pleasure to be able to attend that festival too. I also attended the Oromo Cultural Night, and wow, the Oromo community, driven by its youth, powered by the Oromo youth, in particular the President Abdissa. 90% of Perth's Oromo diaspora live in Cowan, and this is a community that's really fighting to have to continue its culture through language. The Oromo language hasn't been a written language for very long, but it's really part of their identity. And I commend particularly the Oromo youth for really embracing their identity and their culture through language. Of course, I can't forget the Vietnamese seniors. Every time I go and meet with the Vietnamese seniors, it ends in karaoke and dancing. Now, don't judge me here, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but I've got to tell you, if you've got a microphone and some music, I'm there, and the Vietnamese seniors always step it up. So a huge thank you to them. I also attended the Burmese community, Burmese Association of WA. Now, they've been going since 1965 in Cowan. And again, got to sing, of course, and do a bit of dancing as well. But such a wonderful asset to our community. The Burmese community, long-standing community in Cowan, have achieved so much and contributed so much to Australia. And I thank them for everything that they've done. Earlier this month, we had the Perth Chinese New Year Festival, which was organised by the Chung Hua Association of WA, a really, really active association for many, many years. I remember when I was a policy officer at the Office of Multicultural Interests way back when, having a lot to do with the Chung Hua Association and just how active they were in promoting multiculturalism in WA. And just last week, I got to attend the Chin Community National Day, a hugely important day for the Chin community. A bittersweet day considering what's going on at the moment with their community in Myanmar, but still a community that was able to celebrate and again to showcase just how important identity is for their young people, for themselves, and how that makes us stronger. So in Australia, we often talk about Australia being a successful multicultural nation. It's really important to recognise that our diversity is our strength. And in Cowan, that diversity truly is a source of strength for its residents, but also for those of us who have that
has
opportunity.
expired, and I call the member for Bowman.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. There is something to be said for speaking from the heart, but also speaking without notes. But if in your final speech to the Parliament you omit to thank your own daughters and mum, there is something to be said for grabbing some notes and doing it properly. So for the first time since 2011, I confess there's a very, very important prompt sheet, which I assure you has been put together by myself, but there has been some oversight. And I wanted to recognise, as I didn't because I completely lost my way talking about my wife's incredible journey to this country, my 13 and 9-year-old daughters. So, you know, Sophie's this remarkably empathic young leader that I wanted to refer to in my final speech, and she works so hard just to be good at everything she does, and already at her age she's starting to make these tough choices about what she can and can't do to try and not raise ridiculous expectations as we often do on teenagers. And Isabel, who's delighting us at the age of 9 with determination, resolve and insistence on process and fairness, particularly when Dad doesn't show it. And she just drove past the ASIO building this week and said, "Dad, is that the Spy building? I want a job there. Can you get me a tour?" That's a challenge to the Minister. Look, we all have parents who brought us to where we are, but the particular story of my mum and dad is that they fell in love and went to the far corners of the earth as we knew it in the 1960s, which was Hobart, no offence to Tassie, and then to a tropical island of Bougainville, and then to the Papua New Guinea Highlands, one of the most remarkable places on the planet. And Dad took me under the shadows of Mount Gilloway and taught me survival skills, which sometimes came in handy in this building. I learned how to hunt birds using bows and arrows with arrowheads made of possum glenoid processes to hunt a bird without damaging its plumage, something that I haven't done here in Australia with our Indigenous species, you'll be relieved to know. Obviously, my dad, a career from being just a local councillor and giving it a go, and winning when he didn't expect to joining the Joe for PM campaign, to being on the National Party Senate ticket with John Stone, and of course then as a Liberal, mostly in opposition, state MP for a decade. And it was there that I loved door knocking for him and learning a bit more about issues that as a young medical student I never would have otherwise. And as you would all know, anyone in this building, those conversations on the table are so important. I remember, as that great poet Robert Frost said, when he talked about two paths you can take in life, and both that morning equally lay. In leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. And life is a series of choosing paths, and my dad never got a formal education, but he had an incredible journey that was captured in two beautiful novels in the brief period he had between retirement and falling to the thicket of Alzheimer's and Lewy body dementia. And we have a story that's autobiography, but also probably the only first-hand account of the life of a shearer in Australia, because Dad wrote notes and kept a diary. To my lovely sisters Susie and Jules, they're sharpshooters, they're fun, and their husbands and partners are incredibly hardworking. One of them lives in Portsea, which if it isn't heaven, you can certainly see it from there, and Julie and Simon in my ancestral home over the Sunshine Coast, where they run a strata building as part of the tourism sector. In my electorate, just to conclude, in the transport sector, Phil, John and Caitlin Richards, Jennifer Parsons, Chris and Ginny Anderson. Chris is an absolute visionary. I have the only family-owned pub in my electorate, Dawn, Scott and Craig and Greg Hogan, the Bartons, Lynette and Doug, Rob Jones, Jason and Kath Bradley, Jane Gertzer and David Patterson, Albert and Lynn Benfer, Bill Stoddart, Warren and Julianne Pride, and SSI and Steve and Celine Lambourne, IGA's Tyrone and Leanne Jones, Brian and Esty Sieberts, Damien Smarty and Neil, John McCarthy, all in the law, Bruce Dury and Steve Gibson, Victoria and Aaron Myers, Rebecca and Justin Young, Susie Tofollo. And of course my mentors, Don and Wendy Seckham, Don himself, a former cricketer and mayor, Bill and Jeanette Vaughan, Ron, Matt and Mike Loney, Dan and Jacqueline Rigney at IGA Alex Hills, famous for taking on a thief with a flamethrower, Mark Jones, Auntie Margaret, Uncle Norm Enoch, Dale Rosker, Kate Adams, Nat Manzoni on Stratty, Darren Cole, Millie Dave and Sam Nielsen, the two fairies, Stephanie Roper, the Leongs and Dr. Luke Catahanas, of course Pat and Sue Gay, Ryan and Jess McCann, Todd and Emily Howard, Steve and Emily Baxter, Paminda and Julianne Thind and Rohit Patak and Mary Gibb in hospitality, such a tough path they've had, AITC's Mark Hand, Louise and Shane Peters, Brett and Melissa Webster, educators Dr. Lynn and Bob Bishop, Dave Goodwin, Mick and Ruth Bentham, Jason Goodwin, Mick and Moira Goodwin, Steve, Cheryl, Laurie, Tanya and Jared Bonney, Wolfgang Nespor, Paul and Sheree Luxton, Mel and Yana Price-Jones. To me, that means they put off more than they could chew, chewed like hell and made it happen. Thank you.
I call the member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on an important emerging health issue in Australia, the explosion of vaping and the very concerning increases of this phenomenon in Australia and the lack of regulation around it. The electronic cigarette is revolutionising the tobacco industry. It's creating new pathways to smoking and attracting new smokers, especially young smokers. And whilst there is still need for more research around the health impacts of e-cigarettes, it's already known e-cigarettes are unsafe. The federal government's own health department has declared, and I quote, "Many substances have been found in e-cigarette liquids and in the aerosol produced by e-cigarettes, including known cancer-causing agents. Further, some chemicals in e-cigarette aerosols can also cause DNA damage." Deputy Speaker, that's the view of the Federal Department of Health. Given this, alarmingly, I recently had a constituent contact me. He was a very distressed father of two boys, a 5- and a 7-year-old. His two children had vaped at school when another 7-year-old brought a vape to school. The vape had no labelling on it, and who knows what was in it. The 5-year-old, who has a predisposition to chest complications, is still coughing a week later. He can't stop coughing, his father said. This is not an isolated incident. Many parents are concerned and have spoken to me about children accessing and using vapes. Because of this, I'm calling on the Morrison government to immediately tighten legislation and regulations to protect children and the broader Australian population. The Morrison government's weak regulations are clearly not working, and vaping products are now getting a firm grip among children under 18. Effectively, we've got very poor regulations and virtually zero compliance. These products are advertised all over the internet and are designed with packaging to directly appeal to children. One online supplier is now advertising a lolly bag sampler pack. Each pack includes rainbow sherbet, marshmallow, cola bottle candy, gummy bear and fruit gum flavours. Deputy Speaker, if that's not appealing to children, I don't know what is. Now, these products and promotions are lawful within the current weak regulatory environment put in place by the Morrison government. They are designed by big tobacco companies to specifically put young people on a path to smoking tobacco. It is absolutely disgraceful, and the Morrison government needs to act decisively, not tinker with weak regulations. Yes, the Coalition, after a pitched battle in their caucus, did restrict e-cigarettes to prescription only, but there's no compliance. A policy is just smoke and mirrors without compliance and accountability. You get one pop-up asking you whether you're 18, which any 5-year-old can click and say yes. Then you just go on and order the product online. There should be either a complete ban on advertising vape products, or the strictest possible labelling and advertising laws are as there are for cigarette smoking, and heavy fines for anyone breaching these laws. A normal cigarette has 10 to 15 milligrams of nicotine. Many e-liquid bottles contain 24 milligrams. E-cigarettes are very powerful. Nearly all the global tobacco manufacturers, including Imperial Tobacco, British American Tobacco and Philip Morris, aggressively advertise these products via social media, and it's having a significant impact. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, e-cigarette use by Australians aged 14 or older has more than doubled from 2016 to 19, and it's most common among smokers aged 14 to 24. Deputy Speaker, I repeat, the Morrison government needs to protect Australian children. We know the Coalition still receives donations from Big Tobacco from Philip Morris. This is disgraceful. The Coalition must reject the manipulative methods of Big Tobacco and their attempts to put our children on a path to smoking via vaping and e-cigarettes. The Morrison government must act to restrict and shut down the unscrupulous promotion to children. This is the role of our federal government, and action must be taken now. Thank you.
I call the member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, or Deputy Speaker. As this will be one of my last speeches before I retire at the upcoming election, I want to take the opportunity and the guidance from the member for Bowman to thank and acknowledge a few people and organisations which I won't be able to fit into my valedictory speech, which is scheduled for the 31st of March. There have been some fantastic valedictories already delivered by retiring members, some with plenty of humour, some with bouquets and some with some serious wax. But the ability to deliver a valedictory as a retiring member will be a privilege. I will get that many who get defeated in elections don't enjoy. Deputy Speaker, there are 5 councils in the electorate of Swan, and they have all been fantastic bodies to deal with, and to all the CEOs, mayors and councillors I've dealt with over the past 14.5 years, thank you for all your input you have had to my office, which has enabled me to deliver funding to projects that matter. The small community grants, volunteer grants and sporting champions programs have all been fantastic opportunities to provide funding to small groups and individuals that desperately need inventory and or equipment or travel that enable them to exist or compete. The 5 councils in my area, in no particular order, are City of Belmont, City of Canning, City of Kalamunda, City of South Perth, Town of Victoria Park. The City of Swan have a small corner of the electorate, but this was only after a recent inclusion since the last distribution. These areas have been the beneficiaries of over $2 billion in funding through infrastructure and previous grants I mentioned during my time as the member for Swan. Deputy Speaker, during my life I have been surrounded by women who have nurtured me, loved me, laughed with me, and I have learnt many things from them, particularly the art of listening from my 3 older sisters when I was a young boy. My foster mother, Mary Irons, passed away in January 2020 after a long period of dementia, and I sincerely thank the aged care facility in Croydon, Victoria, who looked after us so well for many years. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend her funeral, and I hadn't seen her for 18 months prior to that due to travel restrictions from COVID-19 regulations. Mum loved playing golf as I do, and we had some fabulous times together on the golf course. Fortunately, my wife Cheryl has also taken up the game, and we find this one of the best ways to exercise and spend time together. So as you can see, sport and family have important links. Deputy Speaker, sport has also been a big part of my life, and since becoming the member for Swan, I've worked tirelessly to make Swan the sporting capital of Western Australia. In the electorate, we have the Optus Stadium, which held last year's AFL Grand Final. We have 2 racetracks. We have the Eagles at Lathlane Oval. We have the new home of Football West being built right now in Queen's Park. We have the Royal Perth and Collier Park golf courses, and many more sporting facilities and clubs, which all add to the fabric and community spirit of Swan. Mr Deputy Speaker, the last part of my speech is about Senator Claire Chandler's bill, that women and girls should have the right to play single-sex sport, and my support for Senator Chandler's efforts. As Senator Chandler has said, it's important for everyone to be able to participate in sport, but there should always be a single-sex female category available so that women and girls can compete on a level playing field. Single-sex sport allows women and girls to participate and compete at sport from local level right up to national and international competition. Unacceptably, under current Commonwealth law, sports clubs and associations can be threatened with legal action for offering single-sex sporting events and competition exclusively for females. The Sex Discrimination and Other Legislation Amendment Save Women's Sport Bill 2022 Senator Chandler has introduced will make clear that single-sex sport for women is lawful, encouraged and supported by the Parliament of Australia. The bill will allow sporting codes to embrace single-sex sport for women without the threat of legal action under the Sex Discrimination Act. It does not seek to ban anybody from playing sport. It seeks to restore respect for women's rights, and the categorisation by sex is important in the vast majority of sports. Deputy Speaker, the recent example of the transgender swimmer Leah Thomas in the USA smashing women's records is an example where the system has failed the basic tenet of sport that competition should be fair. Caitlyn Jenner, formerly Bruce, this week called on the NCAA to immediately stop transgender athletes like Thomas from competing against their biological counterparts. Jenner, 72, said Wednesday there was no doubt in her mind that the rules needed to be changed. All of this woke world that we are living in right now is not working, said Jenner, who won a gold medal as Bruce in the men's decathlon at the 1976 Montreal Olympics before transitioning to female in 2015. I feel sorry for the other athletes that Leah is competing against them, because in this woke world you've got to say, oh my gosh, isn't this great? Jenner said, well, no, it's not. Last week, champion swimmer Michael Phelps said, I believe that we all should feel comfortable with who we are in our own skin, but I think sports should all be played on an even playing field. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member for Swan. The question is that the motion be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The Federation Chamber stands adjourned until 4 p.m, Tuesday the 29th of March.